Some wounds do not bleed where anyone can see them. They live in the mind, in the chest, in the quiet moments just before sleep, when the world finally stops talking and the old pain starts whispering again. The memory, the shame, the fear, the anger you thought was gone, the heaviness you learned to carry so long ago that it started to feel like part of who you are. Not because it belongs to you, but because pain repeated long enough can begin to sound like truth. Most people are taught how to survive pain, but not how to release it. How to keep moving, keep functioning, keep smiling, keep showing up. But very few are ever shown how to sit with the storm without becoming it. How to face the past without reopening every wound. How to let the body soften when the heart has been bracing for years. So the mind stays tense, the soul stays tired, and even rest begins to feel like work. But the Stoics understood something most people never learn. They knew that suffering grows when the mind keeps wrestling with what has already happened. They knew that healing begins when you stop feeding pain with fear, judgment, and resistance. They knew that peace is not found by running from your inner world, but by meeting it with calm, honesty, and discipline. Not harshness, not pressure, just quiet strength. Tonight, this meditation is your return. 4 hours to loosen the grip of memory. 4 hours to quiet the thoughts that have ruled too many nights. 4 hours to let the nervous system breathe, the mind settle, and the heart remember what safety feels like. Not to become someone else by morning, but to come back to the part of you that trauma never had the power to destroy. And as the mind begins to soften, something subtle starts to reveal itself. Beneath the noise, beneath the tension, beneath every story you've been telling yourself about what happened, there is a quiet separation waiting to be seen, a space between who you are and what you went through. Most people never notice it. They carry the wound as if it is their name. But tonight, that changes, because the first step toward peace is not fixing the past. It is finally understanding what the past is not. There is a truth that feels uncomfortable at first, but freeing once it settles in. The wound is real, but it is not you. What happened may have been painful, unfair, even deeply scarring, but it did not become your identity unless the mind kept holding on to it as one. This is where many people get trapped without realizing it. They don't just remember the pain, they begin to speak from it, think from it, react from it. Slowly, the wound stops being something that happened and starts feeling like something they are. The Stoics looked at this very differently. They believed that events live outside of you, but judgments live within you. The injury belongs to the past, but the meaning you attach to it lives in the present. And this changes everything, because if the meaning can be shaped, then the weight can be reduced. Not by denying what happened, not by pretending it did not hurt, but by refusing to let it define the entire story of who you are. Think about how the mind works. It tries to organize life into patterns. It takes one painful experience and begins to build a conclusion around it. If someone betrayed you, the mind may whisper that people cannot be trusted. If you were rejected, it may suggest that you are not enough. If you were hurt deeply, it may convince you that pain is something you deserve or something you must always expect. These thoughts feel true, not because they are, but because they have been repeated quietly over time. But repetition does not create truth. It creates familiarity, and the mind often confuses what is familiar with what is real. This is why separating the wound from the self is so important, because until you do, every memory becomes a reflection of who you believe you are, instead of something you experienced. And when that happens, healing feels impossible. You cannot let go of something if you believe it is part of you. You can only protect it, hide it, or keep reliving it. The Stoic approach is not to fight the memory, but to reposition it, to see it clearly without letting it spread into every part of your identity. A painful event can shape you, but it does not have the authority to define you. It may leave a mark, but it does not become the whole surface. And this is where a quiet kind of power begins to grow. There is a difference between saying, "This happened to me," and "This is who I am." One allows space for growth. The other locks the past into the present. One acknowledges pain without surrendering identity. The other merges the two until they are hard to separate. And most of the suffering people carry comes from this silent merging. As the body rests and the mind slows down, it becomes easier to notice this distinction. You begin to see thoughts as movements, not commands. You begin to hear old narratives without immediately believing them. And slowly, the grip starts to loosen. Not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but in small, quiet realizations. You are still here, still breathing, still aware, still capable of observing your own thoughts. That alone proves something important. The part of you that notices the pain is not the pain itself. The awareness remains untouched, even when everything else feels shaken. And this awareness is where peace begins to rebuild. This does not mean the memory disappears overnight. It does not mean the emotion vanishes completely, but it changes your relationship to it. Instead of being pulled into it, you begin to stand beside it. Instead of becoming it, you begin to witness it. And in that distance, something softens. There is no need to rush this process. The mind has spent time building these connections, and it will take patience to loosen them. But every moment you remind yourself that the wound is not the self. You create a little more space, a little more breathing room inside, a little more clarity. And over time, that space becomes something stable, something you can return to, a place where the past is allowed to exist without controlling the present, a place where you can feel without being overwhelmed, a place where you begin to remember who you were before the wound tried to speak for you. That is where real healing begins, not in forcing the pain away, but in realizing it was never the whole of you to begin with. And as that space begins to open, something even more important starts to come into focus. If the wound is not the self, then there is another quiet truth waiting right behind it. The mind may carry the memory, but the moment itself has already passed. What hurt you once had its time, but that time is not now. And yet, the body still reacts, the thoughts still replay, the feeling still returns as if nothing ever ended. This is where awareness becomes more than understanding. It becomes freedom. There is a strange way the mind holds on to pain. It does not always recognize time the way the world does. A memory from years ago can rise up at night and feel as alive as something that just happened. The same tension returns to the chest, the same tightness in the throat, the same rush of thoughts. And in that moment, it does not feel like the past. It feels like something that is happening right now. But it is not. This is one of the most important distinctions the Stoics tried to teach. The event and the memory of the event are not the same thing. One already ended, the other is a mental echo. And yet, most people respond to the echo as if it were the original sound. This is what keeps the pain active long after the moment is gone. At night, this becomes even more powerful. The distractions fade, the noise disappears. There are no conversations to fill the space, no tasks to keep the mind occupied. And suddenly, what was quiet during the day begins to speak louder. Old scenes return, words that were said, things that were done, things that were never resolved. And the mind begins to move backward, pulling the body with it. But the body is here. The breath is here. The present moment is still intact, even when the mind travels. Stoic awareness teaches something simple, but not always easy. It teaches you to notice when the mind leaves the present and gently bring it back, not with force, not with frustration, just with clarity. The thought is there, but the event is not. The feeling is there, but the danger is not. The memory is active, but the moment is over. This is how the mind slowly learns the difference between then and now. The problem is not that memories exist, it is that they are often believed without question. When a painful memory appears, the body reacts automatically. The heart rate changes, the muscles tighten, the breath becomes shallow. It is as if the body is preparing for something that is not actually happening. And without awareness, this reaction continues, reinforcing the illusion that the past is still present. But awareness interrupts this pattern. When you begin to notice the difference, something shifts. The memory may still appear, but it no longer carries the same authority. You begin to see it for what it is, a replay, a mental image, a thought passing through the mind. And once it is seen clearly, it starts to lose its intensity. This does not mean it disappears immediately. The mind has practiced this pattern many times. It will return again. But each time you recognize that it is not happening now, you weaken the connection. You remind the body that it is safe. You remind the mind that it does not need to stay on alert. And slowly, the nervous system begins to trust that message. There is also something important about the way the mind tries to protect itself. It believes that by replaying the past, it can prevent future pain. It keeps reviewing what happened, looking for answers, trying to understand every detail. But this constant review does not bring safety. It keeps the system activated. It keeps the body in a state of readiness, as if something is about to happen again. The Stoics understood that control does not come from revisiting what cannot be changed. It comes from grounding yourself in what is happening right now. The present moment is the only place where action is possible. The past cannot be altered, and the future has not arrived. But the present is always available, always stable, always real. As the mind begins to rest, it becomes easier to return to this point. The breath becomes an anchor, the feeling of the body lying still, the quiet rhythm of the night. These are not ideas. They are direct experiences, and they gently pull the attention away from the past and back into what is real. There is no need to fight the memory. Fighting only gives it more energy. Instead, you notice it, acknowledge it, and let it pass without following it. Like watching a cloud move across the sky. It appears, it changes, and eventually it moves on. The sky does not chase it. The sky does not resist it. It simply allows it to pass. This is how the mind begins to settle. Over time, this practice creates a new habit. Instead of being pulled into every memory, you begin to remain where you are. Instead of reliving the past, you begin to observe it. And in that observation, something important happens. The emotional charge begins to fade. Not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it with attention and belief. The past no longer has the same access to your present state. And in that quiet space, the body starts to relax in a deeper way. The breath slows, the muscles soften, the mind becomes less crowded. Sleep begins to feel closer, not because everything has been solved, but because the mind is no longer trying to solve what is already over. This is where rest becomes possible, not by erasing the past, but by no longer confusing it with the present. And as the mind slowly learns to return to the present, another question begins to rise from a deeper place. If the past is no longer happening, then where does safety come from now? Because for many, the pain was not just in the event itself, but in the breaking of trust. The moment something inside was shaken. The moment someone crossed a line that was never supposed to be crossed. And even after time has passed, that feeling can linger quietly, like a door that no longer feels safe to open. This is where something stronger must be built, not outside, but within. There is a kind of pain that does more than hurt. It disrupts the sense of stability, betrayal, abandonment, humiliation. These experiences do not just leave memories, they leave a question behind. A question that echoes in quiet moments. Can I trust again? Can I feel safe again? And most importantly, where do I find that safety if it was taken from me once before? The Stoics answered this question in a way that feels almost radical today. They did not place their sense of safety in other people, or in outcomes, or in circumstances that could change without warning. They placed it within themselves. They built what they called an inner citadel, a part of the mind that remains steady, protected, and untouched, no matter what happens on the outside. This does not mean they avoided relationships or closed themselves off from the world. It means they understood something clearly. Other people can influence your experience, but they do not own your inner world unless you hand it over. And once that understanding becomes real, something begins to shift. Betrayal often hurts so deeply because it feels like something was taken. Trust, respect, emotional safety. It feels like a part of you was exposed and then mishandled, and the natural reaction is to either shut down completely or to keep searching for that safety in someone else, hoping it will not happen again. But the inner citadel offers a different path. It teaches that your stability does not have to depend on the behavior of others, that your sense of worth is not defined by how someone treated you, that your peace is something you can protect, not something that can be permanently damaged by another person's actions. This does not erase the pain, but it changes your relationship to it. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the question slowly becomes, "What in me remains untouched?" And there is always something that remains. Your ability to think clearly, your ability to observe, your ability to choose how you respond now, even if you could not control what happened before. These are not small things. They are the foundation of that inner space the Stoics spoke about. Rebuilding this space takes time, but it does not require perfection. It begins with small shifts in awareness, noticing when the mind starts to replay the betrayal as if it is still defining you, noticing when you begin to measure your worth based on someone else's failure to treat you with care, and gently stepping back from those thoughts instead of following them, because those thoughts are not protection. They are echoes. The inner citadel is built through clarity, not through defense. It is not about becoming cold or distant. It is about becoming grounded, knowing that even if someone walks away, lies, or fails to meet you with honesty, your inner world does not have to collapse with it. There is also a quiet strength in accepting what cannot be undone. The Stoics did not waste energy wishing for a different past. They focused on what remained within their control. And this is where healing begins to take a different shape, not as a battle to erase what happened, but as a process of strengthening what is still yours. When you stop expecting the past to change, you begin to reclaim energy that was tied up in resistance. And that energy can now be used to rebuild something stable inside you. This inner stability does not mean you will never feel hurt again. It means that hurt will no longer define the structure of your identity. It will pass through, but it will not shake the foundation, because the foundation is no longer built on external validation or fragile trust. It is built on awareness, on understanding, on a quiet confidence that does not need constant reassurance. There is also a form of freedom that comes with this. When your inner world is no longer dependent on how others behave, you are no longer controlled by their actions. You can choose connection without losing yourself in it. You can care without becoming fragile. You can trust, not because others are guaranteed to never hurt you, but because you know you can remain steady even if they do. This is not weakness. This is strength in its most grounded form. As the body continues to relax and the mind becomes less reactive, this inner space becomes easier to access. It is not something you have to force into existence. It is something that has always been there, waiting beneath the layers of fear and memory. And with each moment of awareness, each moment of choosing not to collapse into the past, it becomes a little more solid, a little more real, and slowly the need to guard yourself begins to soften. Not because the world has become safer, but because you have become more stable within it. The sense of safety no longer depends on everything going right. It comes from knowing that even when things go wrong, there is a part of you that remains untouched. That is the inner citadel, a place where betrayal cannot follow you, a place where your worth is not negotiated, a place where your peace is no longer borrowed from the outside world, but built from within. And once that place is felt, even briefly, something changes. The past loses a little more of its grip. The mind becomes quieter. The body begins to trust again, not blindly, not recklessly, but calmly. Because now there is somewhere inside you that cannot be taken away. And as that inner ground begins to feel more stable, another illusion quietly starts to loosen its grip. It is not just the memory or the betrayal that holds people in place. It is the feeling that the pain will never end, that this heaviness is permanent, that this is simply how life will feel from now on. And when that belief settles in, even gently, it can make every step forward feel pointless. But this is where the mind has been misleading you in the most subtle way. There is a quiet fear that sits beneath many forms of emotional pain. It is not always loud, but it is persistent. It says, "This will always be here. This feeling will never leave. This is who you are now." And over time, the mind begins to believe it, not because it is true, but because the feeling has stayed longer than expected. But length of time does not equal permanence. The Stoics understood something that most people overlook. They saw that everything in life moves, everything changes, everything shifts, even when it feels still, pain included. But when you are inside the feeling, it does not seem that way. It feels fixed, heavy, unmoving, like a weight that has settled into the body and decided to stay. This is where the illusion begins. The mind tends to measure time emotionally, not logically. A few minutes of physical discomfort can feel long, but emotional pain stretches time in a different way. It lingers, returns, fades, then comes back again. And because it keeps reappearing, the mind assumes it is permanent. But what is actually happening is repetition, not permanence. There is a difference. Something permanent does not change. It stays exactly as it is. But emotional pain is not like that. It rises, it falls, it shifts in intensity. Some days it feels overwhelming, other days it is barely noticeable. Sometimes it disappears completely for a while, only to return later. That alone is proof that it is not fixed. But when the mind focuses only on the moments when it returns, it ignores all the moments when it was gone. This is how the illusion is maintained. Stoic thought gently challenges this pattern. It does not try to force the pain away or deny its presence. Instead, it invites you to observe it more carefully, to notice its movement, to see that it is not a solid block, but a changing experience. And once you begin to see that movement, even slightly, something begins to shift. The feeling may still be there, but the belief that it will last forever starts to weaken. There is also a deeper layer to this. Much of the suffering does not come from the pain itself, but from the resistance to it. The mind does not just feel the pain, It argues with it. It asks why it is still here. It demands that it should be gone by now. It compares the present to how things used to feel, and in doing so, it adds tension on top of the original experience. This tension makes the pain feel stronger and more permanent than it actually is. The Stoics taught that peace begins when this inner resistance softens, not by giving up, but by allowing what is present to exist without constant opposition. When you stop fighting the feeling, you begin to see it more clearly, and when you see it clearly, you realize it is not as solid as it seemed. It is something passing through, not something that has taken over completely. There is also a kind of quiet patience required here. The mind often wants quick relief. It wants the feeling to disappear immediately. But this expectation creates pressure, and that pressure keeps the system tense. Healing does not follow that kind of urgency. It follows a slower rhythm, a steadier pace. Like the body healing from a physical injury, the process happens over time, not all at once but gradually. And just as a physical wound may ache as it heals, emotional pain may still appear even as it is losing its hold. This does not mean nothing is changing. It means the change is happening in a way that is not always obvious in the moment. The Stoics often reflected on the temporary nature of everything, not to create fear, but to create perspective. If everything changes, then this feeling will also change. If everything moves, then this state will not remain as it is forever. This is not something to hope for blindly. It is something to recognize as a natural part of reality. Even the strongest storms eventually pass. As the mind begins to understand this, it becomes less afraid of the feeling itself, because much of the fear comes from the belief that it will never end. Once that belief weakens, the intensity of the experience begins to soften as well. You are no longer trapped in something permanent. You are moving through something temporary, and that shift changes the entire experience. The body begins to relax, even slightly. The breath becomes easier. The mind becomes less urgent. There is less pressure to escape, and more space to simply allow the moment to be as it is. And in that space, the feeling begins to lose its sharpness. Not because you forced it away, but because you stopped holding it in place with fear and resistance. This is where a quiet kind of hope begins to form, not the kind that demands immediate change, but the kind that understands change is already happening, even now, even in small ways that are easy to miss. The pain may still visit, but it no longer feels endless. It becomes something that comes and goes, instead of something that defines every moment. And over time, those visits become less frequent, less intense, less controlling. Until one day, you notice something simple but powerful. It is not there in the same way anymore, and when that realization settles in, even gently, the illusion finally breaks. And as the illusion of endless pain begins to soften, something even deeper starts to reveal itself. It is not just the pain that keeps returning. It is the quiet argument the mind keeps having with the past. A subtle resistance, a constant replay of how things should have been different, and without even noticing it, this silent fight becomes one of the heaviest burdens of all. There is a tension that does not come from what happened, but from the refusal to let it be exactly as it was. A quiet voice that says, "This should not have happened. It should have gone another way. I should have known. They should have acted differently. Life should have been fair." And while these thoughts feel natural, they create a struggle that has no end, because the past does not respond to negotiation. It remains as it is. The Stoics understood this with a clarity that feels almost uncomfortable at first. They saw that much of human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the constant mental resistance against those events. The mind keeps reaching backward, trying to reshape something that no longer exists, and in doing so, it keeps the pain alive in the present. This is not about agreeing with what happened. It is not about saying it was right or deserved. It is about recognizing that the fight to change it is what continues to drain you. The past has already taken its place in time, but the mind keeps pulling it forward, trying to rewrite it, trying to fix it, trying to undo it. And that effort never succeeds. It only keeps the wound open. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from this, a feeling of being stuck, not because life has stopped moving, but because the mind keeps returning to the same point, hoping for a different outcome, the same thoughts, the same questions, the same imagined alternatives, and each time the body reacts as if the situation is still unresolved. But the truth is, it has already ended. What remains is the resistance. Releasing the need for a different past does not happen all at once. It begins with awareness, noticing when the mind starts to drift into those familiar patterns, the what-ifs, the if-onlys, the endless revisions of something that cannot be edited anymore. And instead of following those thoughts, you begin to pause. You begin to see them for what they are. Not solutions, not progress, just movement within the mind. The Stoics practiced something simple but powerful. They reminded themselves that what has happened is part of the natural order of things, not because everything is good or fair, but because everything that happens becomes part of reality the moment it occurs. And reality does not argue with itself. It simply is. When you begin to accept this, even in small ways, something starts to loosen. The grip of resistance weakens. The need to correct the past softens. And the energy that was tied up in that struggle begins to return to you. There is also a deeper layer to this release. Many people hold on to the past, not just because of the event, but because of what it meant to them, what it said about their worth, their decisions, their identity. And letting go can feel like losing control over that meaning. But the truth is, the meaning is not fixed. The event may be unchangeable, but the way you carry it is not. You can continue to hold it as something that defines you, or you can begin to see it as something that shaped you without limiting you. This shift does not erase the memory, but it changes the weight it carries. The Stoics did not try to forget. They tried to understand, to see clearly what was within their control and what was not. And once they recognized that the past was outside their control, they stopped investing energy in trying to change it. That energy was redirected toward the present, where real influence exists. This is where freedom begins. Not in rewriting what happened, but in no longer needing it to be different in order to feel at peace. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. The mind may resist. It may return to old patterns, trying to reopen the case, trying to find new angles, new explanations. But each time you notice this and gently step back, you weaken that habit. You remind yourself that nothing new will come from that direction. And slowly, the mind begins to settle. There is a kind of quiet relief that comes with this, a sense of lightness, not because everything has been resolved perfectly, but because the constant inner struggle has begun to ease. The past is no longer something you are trying to fix. It becomes something that simply exists without pulling you back into it. This does not mean you forget. It means you stop fighting, and in that space, something new becomes possible. The present moment begins to feel more real, more accessible, less crowded by what has already happened. The body relaxes a little more, the breath becomes deeper, the mind becomes less occupied. You begin to return to yourself. There is no need to rush this process. The mind has spent time building these patterns, and it will take patience to let them soften. But each moment of awareness, each moment of choosing not to engage with the old argument, brings you closer to that quiet release. A place where the past no longer demands correction. A place where you are no longer carrying the weight of what should have been. And from that place, something important begins to grow. A sense of peace that does not depend on changing anything that has already happened, only on no longer fighting it. And as that quiet release begins to take root, something even more subtle comes into view. The past no longer needs to be changed, but the mind still remembers. The images still appear. The words still echo. And for a moment, it can feel like everything is pulling you back again. This is where the next shift happens, not in stopping memory, but in changing your relationship to it. There is a difference most people never learn, the difference between remembering and obeying what is remembered. A memory can rise without asking for permission. It can arrive in the middle of stillness, in the middle of rest, sometimes without warning. And when it does, the mind often reacts automatically. It follows the story. It believes the emotion. It tightens the body. It begins to relive instead of simply observe. This is where the quiet habit of obedience begins. Not obedience in action, but obedience in attention. The mind treats the memory as something that must be followed, something that must be engaged with, something that must be resolved right now. And each time this happens, the memory becomes stronger. Not because it has power on its own, but because it is being given power through focus. The Stoics approached this differently. They did not try to block memory or erase it. They understood that the mind will produce thoughts just as the body produces breath, but they practiced something far more important. They learned to let thoughts appear without automatically agreeing with them, reacting to them, or following them. This is the art of letting memory pass without obedience. It begins with a simple recognition. A memory appears, but it is not a command. It is not an order that must be followed. It is not something that requires immediate response. It is simply a movement in the mind. And when you see it this way, even for a moment, something shifts. Instead of being pulled into the memory, you begin to stand beside it. You notice the details without becoming absorbed in them. You feel the emotion without letting it take control of your entire state. You allow the thought to exist, but you do not kneel before it. This takes practice, but it is not complicated. It starts by slowing down your reaction. When a memory appears, instead of immediately following it, you pause. You notice it. You observe the way it feels in the body, the tightness, the pressure, the change in breath. And instead of pushing it away or diving into it, you simply stay present with it. This creates space. And in that space, you begin to realize something important. The memory does not control your awareness. It only seems that way when you give it full attention without question. But awareness itself remains steady. It is the same awareness that notices the breath, the body, the quiet of the room. That awareness is not disturbed by the memory. It only observes it. The Stoics trained themselves to return to this place again and again, not by force, but by discipline. Each time the mind wandered into old stories, they gently brought it back, not with frustration, not with judgment, but with clarity. The thought is there, but I do not have to follow it. Over time, this becomes a habit. The memory still appears, but it no longer pulls you in the same way. It becomes lighter, less demanding, more like something passing through rather than something you are trapped inside. And as this happens, the emotional charge begins to fade. Not because the memory was erased, but because it is no longer being reinforced. There is also something important about how the mind seeks meaning. When a memory appears, it often brings a narrative with it, a story about what it means, about what it says about you, about what it says about others. And if you follow that narrative, it can quickly expand into something much larger than the original moment. But when you stop obeying the memory, you also stop feeding that narrative. You allow the thought to exist without turning it into a conclusion, without turning it into a judgment, without turning it into a reflection of your identity, and in doing so, you weaken the connection between the memory and your sense of self. This is where freedom begins to deepen. You are no longer trying to control what the mind produces. You are learning to choose how you respond to it. And that choice, even when it feels small, changes everything over time. There will still be moments when the mind gets pulled in, when the memory feels strong, when the old patterns return. This is part of the process. But each time you notice it and step back, even slightly, you strengthen a different pathway. A pathway of awareness instead of reaction. As the body continues to relax and the mind becomes quieter, this practice becomes easier. The thoughts slow down, the space between them grows, and when a memory appears, it no longer feels like something that must be followed. It becomes something that can simply pass, like a sound in the distance, like a shadow moving across a wall. It is there, but it does not require your obedience. And in that quiet non-reaction, something begins to settle deeply inside. The mind becomes less crowded. The body becomes less tense. The need to control or escape begins to fade. You begin to trust that you can experience a thought without becoming it, that you can remember without reliving, that you can observe without obeying. And from that place, the past begins to lose its grip, not through force, but through quiet understanding. And as this quiet discipline of not obeying every memory begins to settle in, something else becomes easier to notice. There are certain moments when the mind does not just remember. It rehearses. It replays scenes with intensity, as if preparing for something that has already ended. And this tends to happen most when the world goes quiet, when the body is still, when the lights are low, when there is nothing left to distract you. The mind returns, not to observe the past, but to argue with it. There is a familiar pattern that unfolds at night. The body is ready for rest, but the mind begins to move in the opposite direction. It pulls up old conversations, old mistakes, old moments that felt unfair or unresolved. It rewinds them, pauses them, plays them again. Sometimes it changes the outcome, imagining what should have been said, what should have been done. Other times it simply replays the pain exactly as it was, over and over again. And without realizing it, the mind turns the past into a kind of courtroom. In this courtroom, there is no rest, only arguments, only analysis, only a constant attempt to reach a conclusion that was never found before. The mind becomes the judge, the lawyer, the witness, all at once. It examines every detail, searching for clarity, for justice, for closure. But no matter how long the trial continues, it never truly ends, because the past cannot testify again. This is where the exhaustion comes from, not just from the memory itself, but from the constant attempt to resolve something that is already finished. The mind believes that if it can just think about it enough, it will finally settle. But in reality, this repetition only keeps the experience alive. The Stoics recognized this pattern long before modern psychology gave it a name. They understood that the mind has a tendency to revisit pain, not because it wants to suffer, but because it is trying to protect. It believes that by reviewing what happened, it can prevent it from happening again. It believes that clarity will come through repetition. But repetition without resolution does not bring peace. It brings fatigue. At night, this becomes more intense because there is no interruption. The mind is free to continue the cycle without distraction, and because the body is tired, the ability to step back becomes weaker. The thoughts feel stronger, more convincing, more immediate. But there is a way to interrupt this pattern, and it begins with awareness. The moment you notice that the mind has entered this courtroom, something shifts. You are no longer completely inside the process. You are observing it. You begin to see the pattern, not just the content, the replay, the analysis, the search for a different ending. And once you see the pattern, you can choose not to participate in it. This does not mean forcing the thoughts away. It means recognizing that the trial does not need to continue. The case has already been closed by time. What remains is the mind's attempt to reopen it. The Stoic approach is simple but powerful. When the mind begins to rehearse, you gently remind yourself that nothing new will be found here. The past has already given all the information it can. There is no new evidence, no new testimony, no new outcome waiting to be discovered. This realization allows you to step back. Instead of following the thought, you return to something real. The feeling of your body resting, the rhythm of your breath, the quiet presence of the moment you are in. These are not ideas. They are direct experiences that anchor you in what is actually happening now. And slowly, the mind begins to shift its focus. There may still be resistance. The thoughts may try to pull you back into the courtroom. They may suggest that you are avoiding something important, that you need to keep thinking about it. But this is just another part of the pattern. You are not avoiding. You are choosing not to continue something that has no end. Over time, this becomes easier. The mind begins to recognize that the rehearsal is not necessary, that safety does not come from endless analysis, that rest is more valuable than resolution in moments like this. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. The need to solve the past is often tied to a need for control. The mind wants to feel that it understands everything, that it has accounted for every detail, that it can prevent future pain through perfect analysis. But life does not offer that kind of certainty. The Stoics accepted this. They understood that control is limited, and that peace comes not from controlling everything, but from responding wisely to what is present. And at night, what is present is not the past. It is the opportunity to rest, to let the body recover, to let the mind settle. As you continue to practice this, something begins to change. The courtroom becomes quieter. The arguments become less frequent. The need to revisit every detail begins to fade. And in its place, a different kind of silence begins to grow. Not an empty silence, but a restful one. A silence where the mind no longer feels the need to prove anything, fix anything, or resolve everything before it can relax. A silence where thoughts can come and go without turning into long chains of analysis. This is where sleep becomes possible again. Not because the past has been perfectly understood, but because the mind has learned that it does not need to understand everything in order to rest. It only needs to stop fighting what has already happened. And in that quiet acceptance, the body begins to let go. The breath slows. The tension softens. The mind becomes less active, less demanding. And for the first time in a while, the night begins to feel like a place of rest, instead of a place of replay. And as the mind begins to step out of that endless courtroom, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Even when the replay slows down, there is often one question that remains. It sits underneath the thoughts, repeating in different forms, carrying a weight that feels personal. Not just what happened, but why it happened to you. And this question, more than anything else, can quietly keep the wound alive. There is a kind of pain that does not come from the event itself, but from the meaning attached to it. A feeling that something unfair was directed specifically at you. That somehow, out of all possibilities, this had to land in your life. And the mind, trying to make sense of it, begins to ask the same question over and over again. Why me? At first it feels like a natural question, a way of searching for clarity, But over time, it can turn into something heavier. It can begin to carry a sense of injustice, of personal targeting, of quiet resentment toward life itself. And without noticing it, the mind starts to build a story around that question. A story that says, this should not have been your path, that others have it easier, that something about your experience is uniquely unfair. And the more this story repeats, the more it strengthens a feeling of being singled out by pain. This is where self-pity begins to take shape, not as weakness, but as a response to confusion and hurt. It is the mind trying to process something that feels deeply personal. But the Stoics saw something important here. They understood that while pain is real, the belief that it is uniquely yours can deepen the suffering. Because when you believe that something is happening to you in a special, unjust way, it isolates you. It separates your experience from the rest of life. It creates a sense that you have been treated differently, unfairly, even targeted. And this feeling can quietly turn into bitterness if it is not seen clearly. The Stoic approach does not deny the pain. It does not tell you to ignore what happened or pretend it was easy. But it shifts the focus away from that question. Not by answering it, but by dissolving its importance. Because the truth is, the question, why me, does not have a useful answer. Even if you could trace every cause, every decision, every moment that led to it, it would not change what has already happened. It would not bring relief. It would only give the mind more material to continue analyzing. So instead of feeding that question, the Stoics asked a different one. Who will I become now? This question does something powerful. It brings the attention out of the past and into the present. It shifts the focus from what cannot be changed to what is still within your control. It does not ignore the pain, but it refuses to let the pain define the direction of your life. This is not about becoming cold or detached from your emotions. It is about becoming clear, recognizing that while you could not control what happened, you still have influence over how you respond to it now, and that response shapes everything that follows. When the mind asks, why me? It looks backward, searching for reasons, for fairness, for explanations. But when it asks, who will I become now? It looks forward. It begins to consider growth, strength, understanding. It opens a path instead of closing one. There is also something freeing in realizing that pain is not selective in the way it feels. It touches everyone in different forms, different situations, different stories, but the same underlying experience of loss, confusion, hurt. And when you see this, even slightly, the sense of isolation begins to soften. You are not alone in having faced something difficult, and this does not diminish your experience. It simply places it within the larger movement of life, where challenges are not punishments, but parts of a process that no one is exempt from. The Stoics believed that events themselves are neutral, but the way we interpret them gives them their emotional weight. And while it may not feel that way at first, there is a choice in how you carry what has happened, not in whether it occurred, but in what you do with it now. This does not mean forcing yourself to see everything as positive. It means allowing the possibility that something meaningful can come from it, even if that meaning is simply becoming stronger, clearer, more aware. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this shift becomes easier to feel. The question, why me, begins to lose its intensity. It may still appear, but it no longer carries the same weight. It becomes just another thought, not a defining one. And in its place, a quieter question begins to take hold. Who am I becoming through this? This question does not demand an immediate answer. It does not create pressure. It simply opens a direction that leads away from self-pity and toward growth, without losing warmth, without losing compassion for yourself. Because dissolving self-pity does not mean becoming hard. It means becoming grounded. It means seeing clearly without adding unnecessary suffering. It means holding your experience with honesty, but not turning it into a limitation. And slowly, something begins to change. The mind becomes less focused on why things went wrong and more open to how things can move forward. The weight begins to shift, not disappearing completely, but becoming easier to carry, easier to understand. And in that shift, a quiet strength begins to form. Not loud, not forceful, but steady, a strength that does not come from avoiding pain, but from no longer being defined by it. And as that strength grows, the question that once felt so heavy begins to fade into the background. No longer needed, because the path ahead has already begun to form. And as that quiet strength begins to take shape, another layer becomes visible. Even when the question, "Why me?" starts to fade, there is still a weight that lingers, a heaviness that feels tied to what happened. But if you look closely, you begin to notice something important. The pain itself is one thing, and the way the mind interprets it is something else entirely. And often, without realizing it, the second becomes heavier than the first. There is a kind of pressure that builds not just from the event, but from the meaning attached to it. What it says about you, what it says about your life, what it suggests about the future. And these interpretations do not always appear clearly. They settle quietly, shaping how you feel, how you think, how you respond. The Stoics made a distinction that changes everything once it is seen clearly. They separated what happens from what we say about what happens. The event is external. It has already taken its place in reality. But the judgment, the interpretation, that lives inside the mind. And this is where much of the suffering grows. Pain, on its own, has a certain weight. It is real. It can be intense. It can leave an imprint on the body and the mind. But when the mind begins to build a story around it, the weight increases. Not because the event changed, but because the interpretation expanded. A single experience can turn into a belief about your worth, your safety, your future. And once that belief forms, it begins to influence everything that follows. The mind starts to look for confirmation. It begins to connect unrelated moments to that same narrative. And slowly, the original pain becomes something much larger. This is how interpretation makes pain heavier. For example, something difficult happens and the mind says this means I am not enough, or this means people cannot be trusted, or this means things will always turn out this way. These are not facts, they are conclusions. But when they are repeated quietly over time, they begin to feel like truth. The Stoic approach is not to deny the pain, but to question the interpretation. Not in a forceful way, not in a way that creates more tension, but in a calm, clear way. To ask, what exactly happened, and what am I adding to it? To separate the raw experience from the story built around it. And once you begin to do this, even slightly, something starts to lighten, because you realize that not all of the weight you are carrying belongs to the original event. Some of it was added later. This does not mean you are responsible for the pain itself. It means you have some influence over how much extra weight you continue to carry. And that realization brings a kind of quiet control back into the experience. The mind does not always like this at first. It is used to holding on to its interpretations. They feel protective. They feel like a way of making sense of things. But many of these interpretations are built quickly, under stress, without full clarity. They are shaped by emotion, not by careful observation. And once they are in place, they are rarely questioned. This is where awareness becomes important again. When a thought appears about what something means, you begin to notice it. Not immediately believe it, not immediately reject it, but simply see it. This creates a pause between the event and the judgment. And in that pause, something changes. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are observing. You are giving yourself space to decide whether that interpretation is helpful, accurate, or even necessary. And often, you begin to see that many of the conclusions the mind draws are not as solid as they once seemed. They begin to soften. There is also something freeing about realizing that the event itself is already complete. It does not grow, it does not expand, it does not change over time. But the interpretation can grow if it is fed continuously. It can spread into other areas of life, influencing how you see yourself and the world. But if you stop feeding it, it begins to lose strength. This is not about forcing yourself to think positively. It is about thinking clearly, seeing what is actually there, without adding layers that increase the burden, allowing the experience to be what it is, without turning it into something larger. As the mind begins to settle into this clarity, the body follows. The tension that was tied to those interpretations begins to ease. The emotional charge becomes less intense, not because the memory has disappeared, but because the extra weight is no longer being added. You begin to carry less, and in that lightness, something else becomes possible. A more balanced way of seeing things, a way that does not ignore difficulty, but does not exaggerate it either, a way that allows space for reality without distortion. This is where Stoic calm begins to take shape, not as a rigid control, but as a steady understanding. Knowing that while you cannot change what happened, you can influence how it lives within you. You can choose not to turn every experience into a defining statement about your life. You can let it remain what it was, and nothing more. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this distinction becomes easier to feel. The difference between the event and the interpretation becomes clearer, and once you see that difference, even once, you begin to understand how much unnecessary weight can be released. The pain may still be there, but it is no longer carrying everything else with it, and that changes the way it feels. It becomes something you can move through, instead of something that defines every step. And as that extra weight begins to fall away, something else becomes easier to notice. It is not just the pain that has been draining you, it is the constant effort to keep it away. The quiet tension of holding things in, pushing things down, staying strong at all times. And over time, this effort becomes exhausting in a way that is hard to explain. Not loud, not obvious, but deeply felt. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep alone cannot fix, a heaviness that lingers even after rest. And often it does not come from what you went through, but from how long you have been resisting how you feel about it, trying not to think about it, trying not to feel it, trying to stay in control every moment of the day. This is emotional resistance. It does not always look like struggle on the outside. Many people carry it quietly. They continue their routines, fulfill their responsibilities, keep conversations going. But inside, there is a constant tightening, a quiet effort to hold everything together, to prevent anything from slipping out, and this effort consumes energy. The Stoics understood something that is often misunderstood today. They did not teach suppression. They did not encourage people to block out emotions or pretend they did not exist. What they practiced was something more subtle, a form of acceptance that allows feelings to be present without letting them take control. This is where the difference lies. Resistance tries to push the feeling away. It treats the emotion as something dangerous, something that must be avoided at all costs. And because of that, the body stays tense, the mind stays alert, always guarding, always preparing, always holding. But this kind of control comes at a cost. It keeps the system activated. It prevents true rest. It turns every moment into a quiet effort to maintain balance. And over time, that effort becomes the source of exhaustion. Stoic surrender is different. It is not giving up. It is not collapsing into the feeling. It is not letting emotions run freely without awareness. It is a calm acknowledgement of what is already there. A willingness to feel without adding resistance on top of it. When you stop resisting, something changes immediately. Not the feeling itself, but the pressure around it. The tightness begins to soften. The need to control begins to ease. And the energy that was being used to push the feeling away becomes available again. This does not mean the emotion disappears right away. It means it is no longer being amplified by resistance. There is also a kind of fear that often keeps resistance in place. The fear that if you allow the feeling, it will become overwhelming, that if you stop holding it back, it will take over completely. But in many cases, the opposite is true. It is the resistance that makes it feel overwhelming. When a feeling is allowed to be present without being judged or suppressed, it often moves more naturally. It rises, it peaks, and it begins to settle, like a wave that reaches the shore and then returns. But when it is resisted, it gets stuck. It remains active beneath the surface, continuing to demand attention. This is why the exhaustion builds. The Stoics practiced observing emotions without immediately reacting to them. They would notice the feeling, name it, and allow it to exist without turning it into a problem that needed to be solved right away. This created space, and in that space, the intensity of the emotion would begin to change, not through force, but through understanding. As the body begins to relax into this approach, the difference becomes clearer. Instead of holding everything in place, you begin to let things move. The breath deepens, the muscles release tension. The mind becomes less occupied with controlling every internal shift. There is a kind of relief in this, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady. A sense that you do not have to fight every feeling that arises, that you can experience something without it becoming a threat, that you can allow discomfort without losing yourself in it. This is where true rest begins, because rest is not just the absence of activity, it is the absence of resistance. It is the moment when the body no longer feels the need to brace, when the mind no longer feels the need to guard every thought. And as that resistance fades, even slightly, the exhaustion begins to lift. You start to feel a different kind of energy, not forced, not driven, but natural, a quiet steadiness that comes from no longer spending so much effort on holding things back. And with that steadiness comes clarity. You begin to see that strength does not come from constant control. It comes from balance, from knowing when to act and when to allow, from understanding that not every feeling needs to be managed, fixed, or avoided. Some just need to be felt and released. This is not weakness. It is a form of discipline that is often overlooked. The discipline to remain present without reacting. The discipline to allow without collapsing. The discipline to trust that the mind and body can process what is there without constant interference. And over time, this discipline becomes a source of quiet power. The kind that does not need to prove anything. The kind that does not rely on constant effort. The kind that allows you to move through your experience with less strain, less tension, less exhaustion. As the night deepens and the body continues to soften, this understanding settles more fully. The need to resist begins to fade. The mind becomes less guarded. The body feels lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because the struggle has eased. And in that easing, something important becomes possible, a deeper kind of rest. One that does not come from escaping what you feel, but from no longer fighting it. And as that resistance begins to fade, something quiet but powerful starts to come into view. When you are no longer spending all your energy pushing feelings away, you begin to see yourself more clearly. Not just what happened, but what remained. Not just the pain, but the part of you that carried it and is still here. And in that realization, a different kind of truth begins to take shape. There is a way the mind often tells the story of the past. It focuses on what was lost, what was broken, what went wrong. And while those parts are real, they are not the whole picture. Because within every painful experience, there was also something else happening at the same time. You endured it. You stayed. You moved through something that once felt impossible to face. But the mind rarely gives attention to that part. It labels the experience as damage instead of capacity. It sees the scar, but not the strength it took to survive the moment that caused it. And over time, this creates a distorted image of yourself, one that feels smaller than the truth. The Stoics saw adversity in a very different way. They did not seek it, but when it arrived, they looked at what it revealed. Not just the difficulty, but the ability to withstand it. They believed that challenges uncover something that comfort never could, a depth of endurance that remains hidden until it is needed. And that endurance is already within you. Every moment you thought you would not make it through, and did. Every day you carried something heavy and still kept going. Every time you felt overwhelmed, but did not completely fall apart. These are not small things. They are evidence. Evidence of a capacity you may not fully recognize yet. But it is there. There is also something important about how survival is interpreted. Many people carry it as proof that something is wrong with them, that they were put through too much, that they should not have had to endure what they did. And while that may be true, it does not change what also happened. You made it through, and that fact, on its own, carries meaning. The Stoics did not measure strength by the absence of struggle. They measured it by the ability to remain standing in the presence of it, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but steadily, continuing forward even when the path was unclear. This is a different way of seeing yourself, not as someone defined by what hurt you, but as someone revealed by what you were able to carry. And this shift changes how the past feels. It does not erase the pain, but it adds something else alongside it. Recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that there is more to your story than the injury itself. There is also a deeper layer to this. The mind often compares itself to an imagined version of life where nothing difficult happened, a version where everything was easier, smoother, more predictable. And in that comparison, it feels like something was taken from you. But that comparison is not real. What is real is the path you have walked, the experiences you have faced, the way you have adapted, adjusted, and continued despite them. And while it may not look the way you once expected, it carries a kind of strength that cannot be developed any other way. A strength that is quiet, but steady. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this perspective begins to settle in a different way. It is no longer just an idea. It becomes something you can feel, a sense that even in the presence of pain, there is also resilience. And that resilience is not something you have to build from scratch. It is something you have already been using. Each time you made it through a difficult moment, you were drawing from it. Each time you kept going, even when it felt heavy, you were relying on it. And even now, as you sit with these thoughts, as you allow yourself to soften without resistance, that same capacity is present, still steady, still available. There is no need to force this recognition. It can grow slowly, quietly, with each moment of awareness, each moment of stepping back from old patterns, each moment of allowing rather than resisting. You begin to see yourself differently, not as someone who is broken, but as someone who has been tested and is still here. not as someone defined by what went wrong, but as someone shaped by what was endured. And this does not make the past good or necessary. It simply places your focus on what remains, the part of you that continues, the part that adapts, the part that carries forward, even when things feel uncertain. As this understanding deepens, something begins to soften inside. The weight of the past feels different, not gone, but no longer the only thing being held. There is space now for something else, a quiet respect for your own endurance, a recognition that what you survived is not just a mark of what happened, but a reflection of what you are capable of. And as that recognition settles in, even gently, it changes the way you move forward, with less doubt, with more steadiness, with a deeper sense that whatever comes next, there is already something within you that knows how to face it. And as that quiet respect for your own endurance begins to settle in, something softer starts to surface. Beneath the strength, beneath the survival, there is often grief. Not loud, not always visible, but present. A kind of sorrow that does not demand attention, yet does not fully leave. And for many, this is where confusion begins again. Because if you've been strong, if you've endured, then why does the sadness still remain? There is a common misunderstanding about grief, that it must be eliminated to move forward, that it is something to fix, something to outgrow, something to silence as quickly as possible. But grief does not work that way. It is not a problem to solve. It is a response to something that mattered, and when something matters, its absence leaves a mark. The Stoics did not deny this. They did not pretend that loss should feel easy or that sorrow should be ignored. But they also did not allow grief to take over the entire structure of a person's life. They understood that grief can exist without becoming destructive. This is where the balance begins. There is a difference between feeling sorrow and becoming consumed by it, between allowing grief to move through you and letting it define every part of your identity. And that difference is not created by force, but by awareness. Grief, when it first appears, can feel overwhelming. It can pull the mind backward, bring back memories, create a sense of emptiness that feels difficult to explain. And in response, the mind may try to escape it, suppress it, or on the other side, dive into it completely, replaying everything over and over again. Both of these extremes create strain. The Stoic path sits in the middle. It allows grief to be felt, but not worshipped. It acknowledges the pain, but does not turn it into a permanent identity. It creates space for emotion while still holding on to clarity. This is what prevents self-destruction, because self-destruction often begins when grief is either denied or amplified without awareness. When it is denied, it builds pressure beneath the surface. When it is amplified, it takes over the mind completely. But when it is observed with calm attention, something different happens. It moves, not all at once, not quickly, but naturally. There is also something important about how grief interacts with the sense of self. When someone experiences loss or deep emotional pain, it can feel like a part of them has been taken. And in that feeling, they may begin to lose connection with who they are outside of that pain. This is where the risk appears. Because if grief becomes the center of identity, everything else begins to fade. Purpose, connection, direction, they all become less clear. And slowly, the person begins to shrink around the experience. The Stoics worked to prevent this by maintaining a steady sense of character. They held on to their values, their actions, their way of being, even in the presence of sorrow. Not because they were unaffected, but because they understood that their character was still theirs to guide. Grief did not remove that. You can feel sorrow and still act with dignity. You can carry sadness and still make thoughtful choices. You can experience loss and still remain connected to your sense of purpose. These things are not in conflict. They can exist together. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes more grounded, this begins to feel more possible. The idea that you do not have to eliminate grief in order to live, that you can carry it without letting it carry you away. There is also a quiet strength in allowing grief without judgment, not labeling it as weakness, not trying to rush it away, just letting it be present, knowing that it is part of a larger process. A process that does not erase what was lost, but slowly reshapes how it is held. And in that reshaping, something important remains. Hope. Not a loud, forced kind of hope, but a quiet one. A steady sense that even with grief present, life can continue to unfold. That meaning can still be found. That connection can still exist. That you are not locked into one state forever. The Stoics believed that emotions do not have to be enemies. They can be signals, experiences, movements within the mind that pass when they are not resisted or exaggerated. And grief, when held with awareness, becomes something that deepens understanding rather than destroying it. It softens the way you see others. It creates space for empathy. It brings a kind of quiet humility that only comes from having felt something deeply. And while it may not feel like it in the moment, this depth does not take away from who you are. It adds to it. As the night continues and the body settles further, this understanding begins to take root. You do not have to push grief away to find peace. You do not have to hold on to it to honor what was lost. You can allow it. Let it rise when it comes. Let it move when it needs to. Let it soften when it begins to fade. Without forcing, without clinging. And in that gentle balance, something becomes clear. Grief can exist without breaking you. It can be felt without consuming you. It can be part of your experience without becoming your identity. And as that realization settles in, even quietly, the heart begins to feel a little lighter. Not because the loss has disappeared, but because it is no longer carrying everything else with it. And as grief begins to settle into something softer, something more balanced, another presence quietly steps forward in the stillness of the night. It is not always tied to a specific memory. It does not always have a clear shape, but it is familiar, a subtle tension, a sense of unease that grows as the world becomes quieter, and without warning, it can begin to fill the space. There is something about the night that changes the way the mind behaves. During the day, attention is pulled outward. There are tasks, conversations, movement, noise. The mind has anchors. But when night arrives, those anchors disappear. The silence expands. The darkness removes visual certainty. And suddenly, the mind turns inward. This is where old fears begin to rise. Not because something is happening now, but because the imagination has more room to move. The mind starts to scan for danger. Not in the environment, but in its own stored experiences. It revisits past threats, unfinished worries, imagined outcomes, and without the usual distractions, these thoughts feel stronger, more real, more immediate. This is what many experience as the night mind. It is not a different mind, but a different condition, a state where the imagination becomes louder than reality, where uncertainty feels sharper, where small concerns can grow into something much larger simply because there is nothing else to balance them. The Stoics understood this tendency well. They recognized that the mind, when left without guidance, often drifts toward fear. Not because it wants to suffer, but because it is trying to protect. It scans for what could go wrong. It prepares for what might happen. It tries to anticipate every possible outcome. But in the quiet of the night, this protection turns into overactivity. The imagination begins to create scenarios that are not real. It fills the silence with possibilities that have not occurred. and the body responds as if they have. The heart rate changes, the breath becomes shallow, the muscles tighten, all from something that exists only in thought. This is where Stoic practice becomes especially important, not as a way to suppress the imagination, but as a way to guide it, to bring the mind back to what is actually present instead of what it is creating. The first step is awareness, noticing that what you are experiencing is a mental projection, not a current reality. The fear may feel real, but it is not based on what is happening now. It is based on what the mind is imagining. And once this is seen, even slightly, something begins to loosen. The Stoics often reminded themselves to return to what is within their control. And in this moment, what is within your control is not the imagined future, not the distant possibilities, but your attention. Where you place it, what you choose to focus on. When the mind begins to drift into fear, you gently bring it back. Not with force, not with frustration, but with clarity. You notice the body, the way it rests, the way it breathes, the stillness of the room, the quiet presence of the moment. These are real, these are stable, and as you return to them, the intensity of the imagined fear begins to fade. There is also something important about how the mind interprets darkness. Without visual confirmation, it fills in the gaps. It creates shapes, possibilities, uncertainties. This is a natural response, but it does not mean those interpretations are accurate. They are simply attempts to create certainty where there is none. The Stoics practiced accepting uncertainty without letting it turn into fear. They understood that not everything needs to be known or controlled in order to remain calm, that the absence of information does not mean the presence of danger. And this understanding changes the way the night feels. Instead of being a space where fear grows, it becomes a space where awareness deepens, a place where the mind can rest, not because everything is certain, but because it does not need to be. As you continue to practice this, the night mind begins to settle. The imagination becomes less reactive. The thoughts lose some of their urgency. They still appear, but they no longer carry the same intensity. They become quieter. There may still be moments when fear rises. This is natural. The mind has practiced this pattern for a long time. But each time you recognize it and return to the present, you weaken that pattern. You teach the mind that silence is not danger, that darkness is not a threat, that stillness is not something to fear, but something to rest in. And slowly, the relationship with the night begins to change. The quiet becomes less intimidating. The mind becomes less active. The body begins to relax more deeply. The sense of unease fades, replaced by a gentle calm. Not because the mind has been forced into silence, but because it has learned that it does not need to fill every moment with imagined threats. This is where true rest begins to emerge. A rest that is not dependent on controlling every thought, but on no longer believing every thought that appears. And as that understanding settles in, the night becomes something different. Not a place of fear, but a place of stillness. A place where the mind can finally begin to let go. And as the night grows quieter and the imagination begins to settle, another layer comes into view. Beneath many fears, beneath many memories, there is something even more fundamental. A feeling that is not always named, but deeply felt. The moment things slipped beyond your control. The moment you could not stop what was happening. And for many, that is where the real wound lives. There is a kind of pain that does not come from what happened, but from the inability to change it while it was happening. A sense of helplessness, a loss of control that leaves a lasting imprint on the mind and body. Even long after the moment has passed, that feeling can remain. quietly shaping reactions, expectations, and the way the world is perceived. Because once control is lost in a painful way, the mind begins to guard against that experience repeating itself. It becomes more alert, more cautious, sometimes more tense, always scanning, always preparing, trying to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. But in doing so, it can create a constant state of pressure, a need to control everything, to anticipate everything, to stay one step ahead at all times. And that is exhausting. The Stoics understood that much of this struggle comes from misunderstanding what control really is. They saw that there are things within your control and things outside of it. And when these two are confused, the mind tries to manage everything, including what cannot be managed. This is where the tension begins, trying to control other people's actions, trying to control outcomes that depend on many factors, trying to prevent every possible difficulty. These efforts may come from a desire to feel safe, but they often lead to the opposite. Because the more you try to control what is outside of you, the more unstable everything feels. True stability, according to the Stoics, does not come from controlling the external world. It comes from governing the internal one, your thoughts, your responses, your choices in the present moment. This is where real power exists. And this is where the sense of control can be restored, not by changing what has already happened, but by reclaiming what is still yours now. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. The past may still hold moments where control was lost, but the present offers something different. The ability to choose how you respond now, the ability to guide your attention, the ability to act with awareness instead of reaction. This is inner governance. It is not about controlling everything you feel. It is about not being controlled by everything you feel. It is about recognizing that while emotions arise naturally, your response to them can be shaped with clarity and patience. As the body rests and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to notice. The space between a thought and a reaction begins to grow. You begin to see that there is a moment, however small, where you can choose how to respond. And that moment is where your power lives. It may not feel like much at first, but over time it builds. Each time you choose not to follow a fearful thought, each time you return to the present instead of being pulled into the past, each time you allow a feeling without letting it dictate your actions. These are acts of control, not over the external world, but over your inner state. And this kind of control is stable. It does not depend on what others do. It does not depend on outcomes going a certain way. It remains available, even when circumstances change. This is what the Stoics trusted. They knew that life would not always go according to plan. That uncertainty is part of existence, that loss, difficulty, and unexpected events are inevitable. But they also knew that within all of this, there is a part of you that can remain steady, a part that can choose clarity over confusion, calm over panic, presence over distraction. This does not mean you will never feel overwhelmed. There will be moments when the old sense of helplessness returns, when the body reacts, when the mind becomes unsettled. This is natural. It is part of how the system has learned to respond. But now there is something different: awareness. The ability to notice what is happening without immediately being taken over by it. The ability to pause, even briefly, and return to what is within your control. This is how the sense of power begins to rebuild, not in large dramatic changes, but in small, consistent moments of clarity. Each time you recognize that you cannot change what has already happened, but you can influence what you do now. Each time you bring your attention back to the present, instead of being pulled into what is outside your control, you strengthen that inner stability. And over time, the feeling of helplessness begins to fade. Not completely at once, but gradually. It becomes less dominant, less defining. It loses its hold as you continue to return to what is yours to guide: your thoughts, your actions, your presence. As the night continues and the body softens further, this understanding settles more deeply. You do not need to control everything to feel safe. You only need to remain connected to what you can guide within yourself. And in that connection, something changes. The past no longer feels like something that has taken everything from you. It becomes something that happened while your ability to respond remains. Still here, still available, still steady. And from that place, a quiet confidence begins to grow. Not loud, not forceful, but real. A confidence that does not come from certainty, but from knowing that whatever arises, there is something within you that can meet it with clarity. And that is a form of control that cannot be taken away. And as that sense of inner control begins to return, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Even when nothing is happening, even when the moment is calm, the mind sometimes goes back on its own, not to something pleasant, not to something useful, but to something painful. And this can feel confusing. Why return to something that hurts? Why revisit what you are trying to move beyond? There is a quiet habit that forms in the mind over time, a pattern that does not always make sense on the surface. The mind returns to certain memories not because they feel good, but because they feel familiar. And familiarity, even when painful, can feel safer than the unknown. This is where the pattern begins to take hold. When an experience is repeated in the mind again and again, it becomes easier to access. It becomes a well-worn path, and the brain, always looking for efficiency, begins to follow that path automatically, not because it is helpful, but because it is known. Pain becomes something the mind recognizes, something it understands, something it expects. And in a strange way, that expectation creates a sense of control, because even though the feeling is uncomfortable, it is predictable, and the mind often prefers predictable discomfort over uncertain calm. This is what makes the pattern so difficult to notice. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like something that just happens. A memory appears, and before you know it, you are inside it again, replaying it, feeling it, reacting to it. And by the time you become aware of it, the pattern has already pulled you in. The Stoics observed this kind of habit in a different way. They saw that the mind, if left unchecked, tends to return to what it knows, even if what it knows is not helpful. And they understood that breaking this pattern does not come from force, but from awareness. The first step is simply noticing the return, noticing when the mind drifts back into familiar pain, not judging it, not trying to stop it immediately, but seeing it clearly, recognizing that this is a pattern, not a necessity, that the mind is following a path it has taken many times before, and once you see the pattern, something begins to shift. You are no longer completely inside it, you are observing it. This creates a small but important distance, a space where you can choose whether to continue following the thought or gently step away from it. This is where the pattern begins to loosen, because the mind learns through repetition. Each time you follow the same painful path, it becomes stronger. But each time you notice it and choose not to continue, even for a moment, you weaken that path. You begin to create a new one. The Stoics practiced redirecting attention, not as a distraction, but as a conscious shift. When a thought appeared that did not serve them, they would return to something present, something real. The breath, the body, the moment they were in. This is not about avoiding pain. It is about not feeding it unnecessarily. There is also something important about understanding why the mind returns to these places. It is not trying to harm you. It is trying to make sense of something that once felt unresolved. It believes that by revisiting the pain, it might finally understand it, control it, or prevent it from happening again. But this belief keeps the cycle going, because the past does not change through repetition, and the mind does not find peace by circling the same experience. The Stoic approach is to recognize that understanding does not always come from more thinking. Sometimes it comes from stepping back, from allowing the mind to rest instead of constantly analyzing. As the body continues to relax and the mind becomes quieter, this becomes easier to feel. The urge to return to the familiar pain may still appear, but it feels less compelling, less automatic, more like a suggestion than a command. And in that shift, you begin to regain choice. You can acknowledge the thought without following it. You can feel the emotion without building a story around it. You can allow the memory to pass without turning it into a full experience again. This is how the pattern loosens, not by fighting it, but by no longer participating in it the same way. There will still be moments when the mind returns. This is natural. The pattern has been practiced many times. But each time you notice it and step back, even slightly, you are changing something. You are teaching the mind that it does not have to go there, that it is safe to remain in the present, that calm is not something to fear. Over time, this creates a new familiarity, a new pattern, one where the mind begins to rest more easily, where it does not feel the need to return to old pain as often, where the present moment becomes more comfortable than the past. And as this new pattern forms, something begins to lighten. The weight of constant revisiting begins to fade. The mind feels less crowded, the body feels less tense, and the sense of being pulled backward begins to weaken. You are no longer caught in a cycle of returning to the same place. You are moving forward, even if slowly, even if quietly. And that movement, however small, changes everything over time. And as that pull toward familiar pain begins to loosen, something even more personal comes into focus. Many of those memories are not just about what happened, they are about who it involved, someone's actions, someone's choices, and without realizing it, a quiet belief can form underneath it all, that what they did somehow says something about you. This is where a deeper kind of weight begins to build. There is a tendency in the mind to internalize the behavior of others. When someone lies, betrays, manipulates, or acts with cruelty, it does not just register as an external event. It begins to turn inward. The mind starts asking questions that feel personal. What did I do wrong? Why did they treat me this way? What does this say about me? And slowly, the actions of another person begin to shape your self-image. This is where confusion begins, because another person's behavior comes from their own character, their own fears, their own patterns. But when you experience it directly, especially in a painful way, it can feel like a reflection of your worth, as if their actions were a response to something lacking in you. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that each person acts according to their own understanding, their own level of awareness, their own internal state. When someone behaves with dishonesty or harm, it reveals something about them, not about the person receiving it. But this is not always easy to see when you are the one affected, because the experience feels personal. But feeling personal does not make it true. When someone acts out of manipulation or cruelty, it is often driven by something within them. Fear, insecurity, a need for control, a lack of clarity. These are not things you created. These are things they carried into the interaction. And while you may have been the one impacted, you were not the source of that behavior. This is where a quiet separation begins to form. What they did belongs to them. How you see yourself does not have to be shaped by it. But the mind, trying to make sense of the pain, often blurs this line. It begins to take responsibility for things that were never within your control. It starts to carry blame that was never yours to carry. And over time, this creates a distorted sense of identity, one that feels smaller, more uncertain, more affected by the actions of others. The Stoic approach gently brings clarity back into this space. It reminds you that your responsibility lies in your own actions, your own thoughts, your own choices, not in the character of someone else, not in their decisions, not in how they chose to behave. This is not about dismissing what happened. It is about placing it where it belongs. There is also something important about how the mind tries to create fairness. When something painful happens, it looks for reasons. It tries to understand why it occurred, and in doing so, it may place the cause within you, because that feels like something that can be controlled or corrected. But this is not always accurate. Sometimes what happened was simply the result of another person's inability to act with integrity, their inability to respond with care, honesty, or respect. And while that may have affected you, it does not define you. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this understanding begins to settle more deeply. You start to see the difference between being affected by something and being defined by it. You can be hurt by someone's actions without those actions becoming a statement about your value. You can experience betrayal without it becoming your identity. You can be treated unfairly without it meaning you deserved it. This shift is subtle but powerful, because once you stop carrying responsibility for another person's character, something begins to lighten. The weight of self-blame begins to fade. The need to analyze every detail of what went wrong begins to soften. The mind becomes less focused on fixing something that was never yours to fix. And in that space, something important returns: clarity. You begin to see yourself more accurately, not through the lens of what someone else did, but through your own awareness, your own values, your own way of moving through the world. There is also a kind of quiet dignity in this, a sense that your character remains intact, regardless of how others behaved. That your worth is not negotiated through someone else's actions. That you are not diminished by their inability to act with integrity. This is where healing deepens, not by changing what happened, but by changing how it is held within you. The memory may still exist, but it no longer carries the same meaning. It becomes something that revealed another person's limitations, not your own. Something that showed you what you do not need to accept, not something that defines what you deserve. And as this understanding grows, the need to revisit the pain begins to fade, because there is less confusion, less self-blame, less need to make sense of something that was never yours to carry in the first place. As the night continues and the body softens further, this clarity becomes easier to rest in. The mind becomes less reactive, less entangled in past interactions. The sense of identity becomes more stable, less influenced by external behavior. You begin to return to yourself, not as someone shaped by another person's actions, but as someone grounded in their own awareness. And from that place, something steady remains, a sense that no matter what others have done, there is something within you that remains untouched. Your character, your clarity, your ability to choose who you are moving forward, and that is something no one else can take from you. And as that clarity begins to settle, something more subtle comes into awareness. Even when the mind understands, even when the thoughts begin to quiet, the body may still react. A sudden tension, a tightness in the chest, a shallow breath that appears without warning. and this can feel confusing. If the past is over, if the mind is calmer, then why does the body still remember? There is a quiet truth in this. The body holds on in a different way. Long after the mind has moved forward, the nervous system can still carry echoes of what was experienced. It remembers patterns of tension, patterns of alertness, patterns of bracing for something that once felt overwhelming. Not as a story, not as a thought, but as a physical response. And this response is not a mistake. It is the body trying to protect. When something intense happens, the body adapts. It learns how to stay ready, how to react quickly, how to anticipate what might come next. And even when the situation has passed, that learning does not disappear immediately. It lingers, quietly influencing how the body feels, especially in moments of stillness. This is why sometimes, even in calm environments, the body feels unsettled. The mind may know that everything is okay, but the body has not fully caught up. The Stoics did not ignore the body. They understood that calm is not only a mental practice, but something that involves the whole being. They worked with awareness, with breath, with attention, to gently bring the body back into a state of ease. Not by forcing it, but by allowing it. This is where patience becomes important. The body does not respond to logic in the same way the mind does. It responds to experience, to repetition, to signals of safety that are felt, not just understood. And those signals come through simple, steady awareness. As you begin to notice the body more closely, without judgment, something begins to change. You feel where the tension sits, the shoulders, the chest, the stomach. You notice the breath, how it moves, how it sometimes tightens without you realizing. And instead of trying to fix it immediately, you simply stay with it. This is where the softening begins. Not because the tension is pushed away, but because it is no longer being resisted. The body senses that it does not need to stay on alert, that there is no immediate threat, that it can begin to release, even if only slightly at first. The Stoic calm is not a rigid control. It is a steady presence, a way of being with what is there without reacting to it. And when this presence is brought into the body, it creates a different kind of response. The breath deepens, the muscles begin to loosen, the nervous system starts to settle. Not all at once, but gradually. There is also something important about how you relate to these physical sensations. If tension appears and the mind immediately labels it as a problem, the body reacts with more tension. It prepares to fight or escape. But if the sensation is noticed without fear, without urgency, it begins to change on its own. This is not passive, it is attentive. You are not ignoring the body. You are listening to it without trying to control it. And in that listening, the body begins to feel safe enough to release what it has been holding. There may still be moments when the old patterns return, a sudden tightness, a quickened breath. This is natural. It is part of how the system has learned over time. But each time you respond with calm awareness instead of resistance, you are teaching the body something new, that it can rest, that it does not need to stay prepared, that it is safe to soften. Over time, this creates a new pattern. The body begins to trust that it does not need to hold on in the same way. The reactions become less intense, the tension appears less often, and when it does, it passes more quickly. The soul, in this sense, is not burdened in the same way as the body. It remains steady beneath these changing sensations. It is the part of you that observes, that remains present, that is not shaken by each physical response. And when you rest in that awareness, even briefly, something shifts. You begin to feel that you are not the tension. You are not the tightness in the chest. You are not the quickened breath. You are the one noticing it. And that distinction creates space. Space for the body to release, space for the mind to remain calm, space for rest to begin. As the night continues and the body settles deeper into stillness, this understanding becomes more real. The sensations may still come and go, but they no longer carry the same meaning. They are seen as echoes, not threats. Movements within the body, not signs of danger, and in that recognition, something important happens. The body begins to trust the moment. The breath becomes slower, more natural. The tension softens without effort, and the whole system begins to move toward rest. Not because everything has been perfectly resolved, but because there is no longer a need to hold everything in place. The body remembers. But it also learns, and with each moment of calm awareness, it learns that it can let go, even slowly, even gently, even now. And as the body begins to soften and trust the moment again, another layer quietly rises to the surface. It is not always loud, it does not always come as a clear thought, but it sits there, underneath many memories. A feeling that something about you was wrong, not just what happened, but what it meant about you. And this feeling can stay long after everything else has faded. There is a kind of weight that feels deeply personal. Shame. Not the kind that comes from your own actions, but the kind that was placed on you through someone else's behavior, words that were said, ways you were treated, moments where you were made to feel small, unworthy, or responsible for something that was never yours to carry. And over time, that feeling can become quiet and hidden. It does not always speak directly. It shows up in hesitation, in self-doubt, in the way you see yourself when no one else is around. It becomes a background tone, something you carry without always knowing where it came from. This is borrowed shame. It was never created by you, but it settled within you. The Stoics understood that much of what we carry comes not from our own nature, but from the impressions left by others. And when those impressions are not examined, they begin to feel like truth. But feeling like truth does not make them yours. This is where the shift begins. Shame often attaches itself to identity. It does not say something went wrong. It says something is wrong with you. And when that message repeats over time, it begins to shape how you move through the world. You may hold back. You may question yourself. You may feel the need to prove your worth, even when no one is asking. But that voice did not begin with you. It came from somewhere. From someone else's judgment, someone else's limitation, someone else's inability to see clearly. And when you begin to recognize this, even slightly, something starts to loosen. You begin to separate what was placed on you from who you actually are. The Stoic practice is not about rejecting everything you feel. It is about examining it, looking closely at the thoughts and emotions that arise, and asking a simple question. Is this truly mine? Or is this something I absorbed without choosing? This question creates space, and in that space, the shame begins to lose its grip. Because once you see that it was never yours to begin with, it becomes easier to release. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually. Each time the feeling appears, you recognize it. You see where it came from. And instead of accepting it as part of your identity, you allow it to pass. This is how it begins to return to its rightful place. Not in you, but where it originated. There is also something important about how the body holds this kind of shame. It often appears as contraction, a closing in, a sense of wanting to hide, to withdraw, to avoid being seen. And this response can happen even when there is no real threat present. It is a learned reaction. But just as the body learned it, the body can also unlearn it. Through awareness, through calm observation, through allowing the feeling to exist without immediately believing it or acting on it. You begin to show the body that it does not need to carry that same response anymore, that it is safe to open again. This does not mean forcing yourself to feel confident or strong. It means allowing yourself to simply be, without the added layer of judgment, without the constant question of whether you are enough, because that question was never rooted in truth. It was planted, and now it can be removed. The Stoics often spoke about returning to your own nature, not the version shaped by external opinions, but the one that exists beneath all of that, the one that is steady, capable, and not defined by what others projected onto you. As the mind becomes quieter and the body more relaxed, this becomes easier to feel. There is a part of you that remains untouched by those old impressions, a part that does not carry that shame, a part that simply exists without needing to prove anything. And when you begin to rest in that awareness, even briefly, something shifts. The old weight begins to feel less real. The need to hold on to it begins to fade. You start to see yourself more clearly, without the distortion that shame creates. And this clarity brings a kind of relief. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. A sense that you do not have to carry what was never yours, that you can let it go without losing anything essential, that you can return to yourself without the burden of borrowed judgment. As the night continues and the mind settles deeper into stillness, this understanding begins to take root. The shame may still appear from time to time, but it no longer feels like a fixed part of you. It becomes something you can see, something you can question, something you can release, and in that release, something else takes its place. A quiet sense of worth that does not depend on anyone else's view. A steadiness that comes from knowing who you are beneath all of that. And a lightness that grows each time you choose not to carry what was never yours to begin with. And as that borrowed weight begins to fall away, another quiet truth comes into view. Even when you understand that the shame was never yours, even when you see clearly that someone else's actions came from their own limitations, there can still be something left behind. A subtle pull, a quiet longing that does not always make sense, the desire to be understood, not by everyone, but by the very person who caused the pain. There is a part of the mind that holds on to this hope, that one day they will see it. They will understand what they did. They will recognize the impact. They will acknowledge the hurt they caused. And in that moment, something inside you will finally feel settled, finally seen, finally validated. This desire is deeper than it appears. It is not just about explanation. It is about closure, about wanting the story to feel complete, about wanting the person who created the wound to also be the one who helps heal it. But this is where the quiet struggle begins, because the same person who acted without awareness, without care, without clarity, may not be the one capable of offering the understanding you seek. And when the mind continues to wait for that validation, it remains tied to them in a subtle but powerful way. The past is no longer happening, but the need for their acknowledgement keeps it alive. This is one of the deepest forms of attachment, not to the person themselves, but to the idea that they will eventually make it right, that they will say the words that release the tension, that they will provide the clarity that allows you to finally let go. But when that does not happen, or happens in a way that feels incomplete, the mind returns to the same place again and again, replaying what could be said, imagining different outcomes, holding on to the hope that something will change, and in doing so, it keeps you connected to the source of the pain. The Stoics saw this pattern clearly. They understood that waiting for others to act differently in order to feel at peace places your stability outside of your control. It ties your sense of resolution to something uncertain, something you cannot guide. And this creates a quiet form of dependency, not on the person's presence, but on their response. But the truth is, your clarity does not need their agreement. Your experience does not need their validation to be real. What you felt, what you went through, what you understood, all of that exists independently of whether they recognize it. And when this begins to settle in, something shifts. The need for them to understand starts to loosen. Not because it was wrong to want it, but because you begin to see that your peace cannot depend on it. There is also something important about how the mind confuses understanding with healing. It believes that if the other person just understood, everything would fall into place. But often, even when understanding is offered, it does not fully resolve the internal experience, because the real shift happens within you, not in what they say, but in how you hold what happened. The Stoic approach is to bring that focus back inward, to recognize that while others may or may not understand, you can understand. You can see clearly what occurred. You can acknowledge your own experience without needing someone else to confirm it. This is where a different kind of closure begins. A quiet one. Not dependent on conversation, not dependent on apology, not dependent on anything external. Just a steady recognition of what is true for you, without needing it to be validated from the outside. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The pull toward that person, toward that conversation, toward that imagined moment of understanding, begins to soften. It is still there, but it no longer feels as strong. You begin to see that holding on to that expectation keeps the connection alive in a way that no longer serves you. And slowly, you begin to release it. Not with force, not with resentment, but with clarity. You allow the possibility that they may never fully understand, that they may never say what you needed to hear, and instead of resisting that, you let it be, because your peace does not require it. There is a kind of quiet freedom in this, a sense that you are no longer waiting, no longer holding your breath for something that may never arrive, no longer tying your sense of resolution to another person's awareness. You begin to return to yourself, to your own understanding, to your own clarity. And in that return, something settles. The need for external validation fades. The connection to the past loosens. The mind becomes quieter, less occupied with what could have been said. And in that quiet, something else becomes possible. A deeper kind of peace. One that does not depend on being understood by those who could not see clearly, but grows from understanding yourself fully and allowing that to be enough. And as that need for understanding begins to fade, something powerful starts to come back into your hands. If you no longer need their validation, if you are no longer waiting for their words, then something inside you becomes available again, your space. Not the external world, not what already happened, but the inner space where all of it is being held. And for a long time, that space may have felt occupied, as if someone else still had access to it, as if their voice, their actions, their presence could still enter without permission. But this is where the deepest shift begins, because nothing from the outside can continue to affect your inner world without passing through your awareness. And once you begin to see this clearly, even for a moment, something changes. The authority begins to return. There is a quiet habit the mind develops after being hurt. It keeps replaying the same voices, the same scenes, the same emotional patterns. And when this happens repeatedly, it can feel like the other person is still causing the pain, as if they are still present, still influencing how you feel, still shaping your experience. But what is actually happening is different. The mind is recreating the experience, not intentionally, not with awareness, but through repetition. It brings back the same thoughts, the same interpretations, the same emotional reactions, and each time it does this without question, it reinforces the feeling that the pain is still being caused. But the Stoics saw something important here. They understood that once an event has passed, its only access to you is through your own mind, through memory, through thought, through interpretation. And while these are real experiences, they are not being created by the outside anymore. They are being allowed inside. This is not about blame. It is about awareness. Because the moment you see that nothing can continue to enter your inner space without your participation, even unconsciously, something begins to shift. You realize that there is a point where you can choose differently, not to erase the memory, but to stop giving it authority. There is a difference between something appearing in the mind and something being given control over the mind. Thoughts will arise, memories will return. This is natural, but what happens next is where your authority lives. Do you follow the thought? Do you build on it? Do you let it expand and take over your state? Or do you notice it, acknowledge it, and let it pass without giving it more energy? This is the moment of choice, and at first it may feel small, almost insignificant, but over time it becomes everything. Because each time you choose not to engage with a thought that brings pain, you are reclaiming a part of your inner space. You are closing a door that was left open. The Stoics practiced this with discipline. They did not try to control every thought, but they were careful about which thoughts they allowed to grow. They understood that attention is like fuel. Whatever you give it to will expand. And so they chose carefully, not out of fear, but out of clarity. As the body continues to relax and the mind becomes quieter, this becomes easier to feel. The thoughts still appear, but they feel less demanding, less powerful, more like suggestions than commands. And in that shift, your role changes. You are no longer someone being affected by every thought that arises. You are the one observing, the one choosing, the one deciding what stays and what passes. There may still be moments when old patterns take over, when a memory pulls you in before you realize it. This is natural. The mind has practiced these patterns many times, but each time you notice it and step back, even slightly, you weaken that pattern. You take back a little more space, and over time, that space becomes stable. The inner world becomes quieter, not empty, but calm. Thoughts come and go without creating the same level of disturbance. Emotions rise and fall without taking over completely. And the sense of being controlled by the past begins to fade, because you are no longer giving it the same access. There is also a kind of strength in recognizing that your inner space is not something that can be invaded without your awareness. It may have felt that way before, when the patterns were automatic. But now, with awareness, there is a boundary, not a rigid one, but a clear one, a boundary that says this thought can appear, but it does not get to stay. This feeling can rise, but it does not get to define everything. This memory can exist, but it does not get to control my state. And as this boundary becomes clearer, the sense of self becomes stronger. Not in a forceful way, but in a steady one. A quiet confidence that you are no longer at the mercy of every thought, every memory, every emotional reaction. That there is a part of you that remains stable, that remains aware, that remains in control of how your inner world is shaped. And from that place, something important happens. The past begins to lose its influence, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer has the same access. It no longer moves freely through your mind without being noticed. It no longer shapes your state without your awareness. You begin to reclaim your space, fully. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Calm, clarity, and a sense that your inner world belongs to you again. And as that inner space becomes yours again, another quiet pain may begin to rise into awareness. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt. The memory of being overlooked, the moment you were dismissed, ignored, left behind, or replaced. And even when time has passed, there can still be a trace of it, a subtle sting that appears without warning. Rejection has a unique kind of weight. It does not just hurt in the moment, it leaves behind a question, a quiet doubt that settles into the mind. Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? Why was I not chosen? And these questions, even when unspoken, can shape how you see yourself over time. This is where the pain deepens. Because rejection does not only come from what happened, it comes from what the mind believes it means. The Stoics approached this differently. They did not measure their worth by how they were received by others. They understood that acceptance and rejection are based on factors that are often outside of your control. Another person's preferences, their fears, their limitations, their circumstances. And none of these are stable measures of your value. But the mind, seeking certainty, often turns rejection into a personal judgment. It interprets the event as a reflection of identity, as if being dismissed means you are not worthy, as if being replaced means you were not enough. But these are conclusions, not facts. What happened is simple. A person chose differently. A situation did not continue. A connection ended or never formed. These are events. But the meaning attached to them is what creates the lasting pain. And when that meaning is not examined, it begins to shape your sense of self. This is where healing begins, not by denying the hurt, but by separating the event from the interpretation, by seeing clearly that rejection does not define your worth. It reflects a moment, a decision, a circumstance, not your entire value as a person. There is also something important about how the mind compares. It looks at others who were chosen, accepted, included, and it creates a contrast. It suggests that they were better, more deserving, more valuable, and in that comparison, the sense of humiliation begins to grow. But comparison is not a clear measure. It is influenced by perception, by limited information, by assumptions that may not be accurate. The Stoics understood that comparing yourself constantly to others creates instability, because your sense of worth becomes dependent on something external, something always changing. Instead, they focused inward, on character, on actions, on the way they lived, regardless of how they were received. This creates a different kind of foundation, one that is not shaken by acceptance or rejection. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this perspective begins to settle more deeply. The memory of rejection may still appear, but it feels different. Less like a judgment, more like an experience that has passed. The sting softens, the questions lose some of their urgency. You begin to see that being rejected does not mean being diminished. It means that something did not align, and that alignment is not something you control. There is also a quiet strength in realizing that you can continue to show up as yourself, even after being dismissed. That you do not need to reshape who you are to fit every situation. That your value does not depend on being chosen in every moment. This does not remove the pain immediately, but it changes how it is held. Instead of turning inward as self-doubt, it becomes something you can observe, something you can understand without letting it define you. And in that understanding, the sense of humiliation begins to fade, because it was never truly about your worth. It was about a moment that did not continue. As this clarity grows, something else begins to take its place. A quiet confidence. Not based on external validation, but on internal steadiness. A sense that you can face rejection without losing yourself. That you can experience being overlooked without becoming invisible to yourself. This is where dignity returns, not through proving anything to others, but through remaining connected to who you are, regardless of how others respond. And as that connection deepens, the past begins to lose its grip. The memory may still exist, but it no longer carries the same weight. It becomes something that happened, not something that defines. And in that shift, something important opens up. Space. Space to move forward without carrying the same doubt. Space to engage with life without constant fear of rejection. Space to exist without measuring yourself through every outcome. As the night continues and the mind settles further, this space becomes more real. The need to revisit those moments begins to fade. The emotional charge softens, the body relaxes, and what remains is something steady. A sense that you are not less because someone else could not see you fully. A sense that your worth is not determined by a single moment. A sense that you can rise from that experience without carrying it as a label. And from that place, something begins to grow. A quiet resilience, one that does not need to prove itself, but simply continues steady and whole. And as that quiet resilience begins to settle in, another subtle shift starts to take shape. After pain, after rejection, after moments where something felt unsafe or uncertain, the mind naturally becomes more careful, more alert, more protective. And at first, this feels like strength, like learning, like growth. But over time, something can quietly change. Caution can slowly turn into fear. And when that happens, life begins to shrink in ways that are hard to notice at first. There is nothing wrong with being cautious. In fact, it is a form of wisdom. It allows you to recognize patterns, to avoid unnecessary harm, to move through life with awareness. But caution is meant to guide you, not to control you. It is meant to inform your choices, not to limit your entire experience. Fearful living is different. It does not just suggest awareness. It demands avoidance. It closes doors before they are even approached. It turns possibilities into risks and risks into reasons to stay still. And slowly, without realizing it, the world becomes smaller. Not because it is smaller, but because your movement within it has become restricted. This is how trauma can reshape behavior. After being hurt, the mind tries to prevent that pain from happening again. It builds protective layers. It becomes more selective, more guarded, more careful. And this can be helpful at first. But when those protective patterns are not examined, they can become rigid. They stop adapting. They stop allowing growth. And what once served as protection begins to limit your life. The Stoics understood this balance deeply. They did not encourage reckless behavior or blind trust, but they also did not allow fear to dictate their actions. They focused on something more stable, clear judgment, the ability to see a situation for what it is, without exaggeration, without distortion, without letting past pain automatically define present decisions. This is where the difference becomes clear. Caution observes, fear assumes. Caution looks at the present moment and asks what is actually happening here. Fear looks at the past and assumes it will happen again. Caution allows movement with awareness. Fear stops movement altogether. And when you begin to see this distinction, something starts to shift. You notice when your decisions are coming from clarity and when they are coming from avoidance. You begin to feel the difference in your body. Caution feels steady, grounded, calm. Fear feels tight, urgent, restrictive. One expands your ability to respond wisely. The other narrows your ability to respond at all. This awareness is where change begins. Not by forcing yourself to act against fear, but by understanding where it is coming from. seeing that the mind is trying to protect you, but using outdated information. It is responding to a past experience as if it is still present. And once you recognize that, even slightly, the grip begins to loosen. The Stoics practice stepping into discomfort with awareness, not avoidance. They understood that growth requires movement, not reckless movement, but deliberate, thoughtful action. Action that is guided by reason, not by fear. This is how courage returns, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet and steady. A willingness to move forward even when there is uncertainty. A trust that you can handle what arises, not because nothing will go wrong, but because you have the capacity to respond. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The urge to avoid begins to soften. The tension around certain decisions begins to ease. You start to see that not every situation is the same as the past. Not every experience will repeat. And this opens something important. Choice. You are no longer reacting automatically based on old patterns. You are deciding based on what is present now. You are allowing yourself to engage with life again without carrying the same level of fear. This does not mean ignoring risk. It means seeing it clearly, without adding unnecessary weight to it, without turning every possibility into a threat. And in that clarity, movement becomes possible again. You begin to take small steps, not all at once, not without awareness, but gradually, each step showing the mind that it does not need to stay locked in protection, that it can allow new experiences without repeating old pain. And with each step, the world begins to open again. The space around you feels larger. The possibilities feel less restricted. The sense of being trapped begins to fade. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding settles more fully. You do not need to live in constant defense to stay safe. You can move through life with awareness, without letting fear take control. You can be cautious without becoming closed. You can be aware without becoming restricted. You can be strong without becoming rigid. And in that balance, something important begins to return. Freedom. Not from all risk, but from the constant need to avoid it. And from that freedom, a quiet courage begins to grow. One that does not rush, one that does not force, but one that continues to move forward, steady and clear. And as that quiet courage begins to return, another belief, often hidden, often unspoken, starts to surface. It is not always obvious, but it shapes how long pain is carried. A feeling that if you let go, then what happened did not matter. That releasing the pain somehow erases the significance of the experience. And so, without realizing it, the mind holds on, as if the pain itself is proof. There is a quiet assumption that suffering must continue in order to honor what was lost, what was endured, what was taken. That if the feeling softens, if the memory becomes lighter, then something important is being forgotten. And because of this, the mind resists letting go, not because it wants to suffer, but because it wants to respect the past. This is where the weight lingers, because pain becomes tied to meaning. The Stoics saw something different. They understood that meaning does not come from how long something hurts. It comes from how it is understood, how it is integrated, how it shapes the way you move forward. And holding on to suffering is not the same as honoring what happened. It is continuing it. There is a difference between remembering and reopening the wound each time you remember, between acknowledging the impact and reliving the pain as if it must stay active to remain important. And when this difference is not seen clearly, the mind keeps the pain alive, believing it is doing something necessary. But it is not. What happened already matters. It has already left its mark. It has already shaped your understanding, your awareness, your path. It does not need to be kept alive through continued suffering in order to remain real. Its place in your story is already secure. Letting go does not erase that. It simply changes how it is carried. There is also something deeply human about this attachment. When something painful happens, especially something significant, it becomes part of your identity for a time. It shapes how you see yourself. And releasing the pain can feel like losing a part of that identity, as if you are leaving something behind. But what you are leaving behind is not the experience itself. It is the unnecessary weight. The Stoic approach is to see clearly what serves you and what does not. Not in a harsh way, but in a steady, grounded way. To recognize that continuing to bleed does not prove depth. It does not prove strength. It only prolongs suffering. And suffering does not need to be extended to be meaningful. There is a quiet strength in allowing something to soften, in letting the intensity fade without forcing it to stay. In recognizing that the importance of what happened is not measured by how much pain remains, but by what has been learned, what has been understood. This is where healing deepens, not in holding on, but in releasing with awareness. There may still be a part of the mind that resists this, that says, if I let go, I am forgetting. If I feel better, I am minimizing what happened. But this is another interpretation, not a truth. Letting go is not forgetting. It is no longer carrying the same burden. The memory can remain. The understanding can remain. The lessons can remain. What changes is the weight attached to them. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this becomes easier to feel. The need to hold on to the pain begins to soften. The urgency fades. The memory becomes something that exists without demanding the same emotional response. And in that shift, something opens, a sense of lightness. Not because the past has been erased, but because it is no longer being carried in the same way. You begin to see that you can honor what happened without suffering from it continuously. You can remember without reopening. You can respect the experience without reliving the pain. You can carry the meaning without carrying the wound. This is not a loss. It is a transformation. And as that transformation takes place, something important becomes clear. You do not need to bleed to prove that something mattered. Its meaning is already part of you, quietly, steadily, without needing to hurt forever. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding begins to settle more fully. The mind becomes less attached to the idea of holding on. The heart feels less pressure to keep the pain alive, and what remains is something calmer, something more balanced, a sense that you are allowed to feel better, allowed to move forward, allowed to live without carrying the same weight. And in that allowance, something shifts, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently. The past remains, but it no longer demands your suffering. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like relief. And as that quiet relief begins to settle in, another pattern, often hidden, often unnoticed, starts to reveal itself. Even when the past has softened, even when the weight begins to lift, there can still be a voice inside that turns inward, not toward understanding, but toward judgment. A quiet pressure that says you should have done better, you should have known, you should have been stronger. And without realizing it, the pain shifts direction, not outward anymore, but inward. There is a form of harm that does not come from others, but from the way the mind speaks to itself after everything has already happened. A kind of silent violence, one that does not leave visible marks, but shapes how you feel about yourself over time. Self-blame. It often begins subtly, a thought here and there, a a question that seems harmless at first. Why didn't I see it sooner? Why didn't I leave earlier? Why did I allow that to happen? And while these thoughts feel like attempts to understand, they often turn into something heavier. They turn into judgment. The mind stops asking questions to learn and starts asking questions to punish. This is where the pattern deepens, because instead of processing what happened with clarity, the mind begins to assign fault to itself. It rewrites the past with the knowledge you have now and holds your past self accountable for not knowing what you could not have known at the time. And this creates a kind of unfair standard. You begin to measure your past actions with present awareness. You expect yourself to have seen what you only understand now. And in doing so, you place yourself in a position where you can never meet that expectation. This is the silent violence. Not loud, not aggressive, but constant. A steady erosion of self-trust. A quiet belief that you failed in some way, even when you were simply responding with the awareness you had at that moment. The Stoics approached this differently. They understood that every action is taken based on the understanding available at the time. People act according to what they know, what they believe, what they perceive in that moment. And when that understanding changes, it becomes easy to look back and judge. But that judgment is not useful. It does not change the past. It does not bring clarity. It only adds another layer of suffering. The Stoic approach is to replace judgment with understanding. To look at your past self not with criticism, but with context. To see clearly what you knew, what you felt, what you were working with at that time. And instead of asking why you did not act differently, to recognize that you acted in the way that made sense to you then. This is not excuse. It is clarity. There is also something important about how survival is often misunderstood. When people go through difficult experiences, they do what they can to get through them. Sometimes that means staying longer than they should. Sometimes it means not speaking up. Sometimes it means making choices that, in hindsight, they wish had been different. But those choices were not made from a place of weakness. They were made from a place of survival. And survival is not perfect. It is not clean. It is not always aligned with what you later understand to be the best path. But it is real. And it kept you here. The Stoics did not expect perfection. They expected effort, awareness, and growth. They understood that mistakes are part of the process of learning, that clarity comes after experience, not before it. And so, they did not punish themselves for what they did not know. They used it as information, as insight, as something that could guide future action, not something that should be used to attack the self. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this shift becomes easier to feel. The voice of self-blame may still appear, but it begins to sound different, less convincing, less absolute, more like a habit than a truth. And once you see it as a habit, you can begin to step back from it. You can notice when the mind starts to turn inward with criticism. You can pause before following that thought. You can choose to respond with understanding instead of judgment. This is where the pattern begins to change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually. Each time you replace self-blame with clarity, you soften that internal tension. You begin to rebuild trust in yourself, not by pretending you did everything right, but by accepting that you did what you could with what you knew. And that is enough. There is also a kind of dignity in this acceptance, a sense that you do not need to punish yourself to prove that you care, that you do not need to carry guilt to show that something mattered, that you can learn without attacking yourself in the process. This is not weakness, it is strength with awareness. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding begins to settle more fully. The need to judge yourself begins to fade. The internal pressure eases. The mind becomes less occupied with what should have been done differently. And in that space, something else begins to grow. Compassion, not the kind that ignores responsibility, but the kind that sees clearly without adding unnecessary harm. The kind that allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of constant self-criticism. And from that place, something important becomes possible. You begin to stand on your own side again, not against yourself, not in conflict with your past, but in alignment with who you are becoming. And in that alignment, the silent violence begins to end, quietly, steadily, leaving behind something lighter, something calmer, something that feels like peace. And as that inner conflict begins to soften, something deeper starts to rise from beneath it. When the blame fades, when the tension eases, when the mind stops turning against itself, what remains is not emptiness. It is something quieter, something that has been forming all along, even in the hardest moments. Because not every season is meant to build comfort. Some seasons break things open. There are periods in life that feel like everything is falling apart. Plans collapse, trust is shaken, direction becomes unclear, and what once felt stable no longer holds. These are the moments the mind resists the most, the ones it tries to escape, fix, or rush through. But the Stoics saw these seasons differently. They did not see ruin as the end of something valuable. They saw it as a process that reveals what could not be seen before, not by destroying the self, but by stripping away what was never stable to begin with. There is a kind of clarity that only comes when familiar structures fall away. When you can no longer rely on what you once depended on, the mind is forced to look inward, to question what is truly solid, what remains when everything else changes. And in that questioning, something begins to take shape. Not immediately, not easily, but steadily. The soul begins to learn, not in the way information is learned, but in the way experience settles into understanding. A deeper awareness of what matters, a sharper sense of what can be controlled and what cannot. A quieter approach to life that does not rely on constant certainty. This is not something that can be taught without difficulty. It is something that is formed through it. In seasons of ruin, the mind is stripped of illusion, the belief that everything will go according to plan, the expectation that people will always act as hoped, the assumption that control extends beyond what it truly does. And while this can feel disorienting at first, it creates space. Space for something more grounded to emerge. The Stoics practiced using these moments as training, not by denying the pain, but by observing what it revealed. When something breaks, it shows where attachment was placed. When something fails, it shows where expectation was too rigid. When something is lost, it shows what was being held too tightly. And in seeing this, the mind begins to adjust. It becomes less reactive, less dependent, less shaken by change. This is where restraint begins to form, not as suppression, but as balance. The ability to experience emotion without being carried away by it. The ability to face difficulty without losing direction. The ability to remain steady even when things are uncertain. This restraint is not something that appears suddenly. It is built slowly, through moments of awareness, through choosing not to react immediately, through allowing space between experience and response, through learning that not every feeling requires action. And as this restraint grows, something else begins to deepen. Understanding. Not the kind that comes from thinking more, but the kind that comes from seeing more clearly. A recognition that life does not always move in straight lines. That growth often comes from disruption. That strength is not built in comfort, but in adaptation. There is also a quiet humility that forms in these seasons. A sense that control is limited, that certainty is temporary, that the path is not always visible. And instead of resisting this, the Stoics leaned into it. They allowed uncertainty to exist without turning it into fear. They accepted change without trying to force stability where it could not exist. This is where inner depth begins to take shape, not as something you try to achieve, but as something that forms when you stop resisting what is. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this understanding begins to settle more fully. The memory of those difficult seasons may still be there, but it feels different. Less like something that broke you, more like something that shaped you. The pain may still be remembered, but it no longer defines the experience, because alongside it, something else has grown. Awareness, restraint, clarity, and a quiet strength that was not visible before. There is also a sense of trust that begins to return. Not trust that everything will go smoothly, but trust that whatever comes, you have the capacity to meet it. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with a steadiness that has been built through experience. This is what the soul learns, not through ease, but through endurance, not through certainty, but through adaptation, not through avoiding difficulty, but through moving through it with awareness. And as this learning settles in, something begins to shift. The past no longer feels like a series of broken moments. It becomes a foundation, not one that holds pain in place, but one that supports growth. And from that foundation, something steady begins to rise. A sense that even in seasons of ruin, something within you was being formed, something that remains, something that continues to guide you forward, quietly, steadily, without needing to prove itself. And in that quiet strength, the past takes on a different meaning. Not as something that ended you, but as something that shaped you into who you are becoming. And as that deeper understanding begins to settle, something else gently starts to fall away. The need to explain. The need to make others see, to justify what was felt, to tell the story again and again so it finally makes sense to someone else. And while this can feel necessary at first, over time it can become another quiet source of exhaustion. There is a kind of pressure that comes from wanting to be understood, to have someone acknowledge the weight of what you carried, to have your experience validated, confirmed, recognized, and this is natural. It comes from a human place. But when this need turns into constant explanation, something begins to happen. The wound stays open. Each time the story is told with the same intensity, the mind returns to the same place. It rebuilds the same emotional landscape. It reactivates the same feelings, and without realizing it, the act of explaining becomes a way of reliving. Not because you want to suffer, but because you are still seeking resolution. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that while sharing can be helpful, constant repetition without movement can keep the mind anchored in the past. It can turn the experience into something that never fully settles, because it is being revisited in the same way each time. This is where a shift begins, not in suppressing your story, not in denying what happened, but in recognizing when explanation is no longer serving you, when it is no longer bringing clarity, but instead reinforcing the same emotional pattern. Because not everyone will understand. Not everyone has the capacity, the awareness, or the perspective to fully see what you went through. And when you continue trying to explain yourself to those who cannot meet you there, it creates frustration. A sense of being unseen. A feeling that something important is missing. But the truth is, your experience does not lose its value because someone else cannot understand it. It remains real. It remains valid, without needing to be explained over and over again. The Stoic approach brings the focus back inward. It asks a different question. Not do they understand me, but do I understand what happened? Do I see it clearly, without distortion? without the need for constant external confirmation. And when that clarity begins to form, something changes. The need to explain starts to fade, not because the story is unimportant, but because it is already understood where it matters most, within your own awareness, within your own perspective, and that understanding carries a different kind of weight, a quieter one. There is also a kind of dignity in this quietness, when you no longer feel the need to justify your pain, to prove its depth, to make others see it exactly as you do. You begin to stand differently, more grounded, less dependent on external responses, more at peace with your own understanding. This does not mean you never speak about it. It means you choose when and how, without needing it to be validated every time. You speak from clarity, not from a need to be seen, and that changes the experience. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this shift becomes easier to feel. The urge to explain begins to soften. The need to revisit every detail fades. The story becomes something you hold, not something you have to constantly present. And in that space, something else begins to grow. Silence. Not empty silence, but peaceful silence. A silence where the mind is no longer repeating the same explanations, where the heart is no longer trying to be understood by everyone, where your experience simply exists, without needing to be constantly expressed. This is where the wound begins to close, not because it was ignored, but because it is no longer being reopened. The Stoics valued this kind of inner stability. They knew that true understanding does not always need words, that clarity can exist without explanation, that peace can be found without constant communication of what was felt. And as you begin to settle into this, something becomes clear. You do not need to explain your pain for it to be real. You do not need to justify your experience for it to matter. You do not need to repeat the story for it to be understood, because you already understand it. And that is enough. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this quiet dignity begins to settle in. The mind becomes less occupied with telling the story. The emotional charge begins to fade. The need for external validation loses its urgency. And what remains is something steady, a sense of peace that does not depend on being understood by others, a sense of clarity that does not require constant explanation, a sense of dignity that comes from simply knowing. And in that knowing, the mind begins to rest, fully, without needing to say another word. And as that quiet dignity begins to take root, something even deeper starts to loosen its hold. When the need to explain fades, another expectation often remains beneath it, a silent hope, that one day something will come from the outside to make everything feel complete. An apology, a confession, a moment of justice, and with it, closure. There is a powerful belief that closure is something given, that it arrives through another person's words, that when they finally understand, finally admit, finally acknowledge, something inside you will settle completely. The story will end, the weight will lift. But this belief, though natural, can quietly keep you waiting. And waiting keeps the past alive. Because as long as closure depends on someone else, your peace depends on something uncertain, something outside your control, something that may never come in the way you expect. This is where the trap forms. The mind stays connected to the person, to the event, to the unfinished feeling. Not because the moment is still happening, but because it is still being held open, still waiting for resolution, still expecting something to arrive that will finally make sense of it all. But the Stoics saw something different. They understood that closure is not something that is delivered from the outside. It is something that forms within, when the mind stops waiting, when it no longer needs a final word, a perfect explanation, or a balanced outcome to move forward. Because the truth is, Even when apologies come, they are not always enough. Even when justice appears, it does not always bring peace. Even when someone confesses or explains, it does not always resolve the internal experience. Because the real shift does not come from what they say, it comes from how you hold what happened. There is also something subtle about the way the mind imagines closure. It creates a perfect version, a moment where everything is said exactly right, where the other person understands completely, where the pain is acknowledged in a way that feels satisfying. But this version rarely exists in reality, and waiting for it keeps the mind in a state of delay. A quiet pause where life cannot fully move forward because something feels unfinished. The Stoic approach gently breaks this illusion. It does not deny the desire for closure, but it removes the dependency on others to provide it. It shifts the focus from what might happen externally to what is already possible internally. Understanding, acceptance, clarity. These do not require another person's participation. They are available within your own awareness. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this begins to feel more real. The expectation of an apology, a confession, or a final explanation starts to lose its intensity. Not because it would not have mattered, but because it is no longer necessary for your peace. You begin to see that holding on to that expectation keeps you connected to the past in a way that no longer serves you, and slowly you begin to release it. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. You allow the possibility that the closure you imagined may never arrive in that form, and instead of resisting that, you accept it, not as something unfair, but as something outside your control. This is where freedom begins. Because once you stop waiting, something opens. The mind becomes less occupied with what could have been said. The heart becomes less tied to what might happen in the future. The energy that was held in that expectation begins to return to you, and with that energy, something new becomes possible. Movement. You are no longer paused, waiting for something external to complete the story. You begin to move forward, not because everything has been resolved perfectly, but because you no longer need it to be. This is a different kind of closure, a quiet one that does not depend on anyone else, one that forms when you understand what happened, accept what cannot be changed, and release the need for it to be different. The Stoics trusted this kind of resolution. They knew that peace does not come from perfect endings. It comes from clear understanding, from no longer resisting what is already complete, from no longer holding the door open for something that may never enter. And as this understanding settles in, something shifts. The past begins to feel more distant, not erased, but no longer waiting to be finished. The mind becomes quieter, the body relaxes more deeply, and the sense of being stuck begins to fade. As the night deepens and the stillness grows, this quiet closure becomes more present. You are no longer looking outward for something to complete your experience. You are allowing it to be complete, here, now, without needing anything more. And in that quiet completion, something settles fully, a sense that you are no longer waiting, no longer delayed, no longer tied to an outcome that is not yours to control, just present, steady, and free to move forward without carrying that unfinished weight. And as that quiet sense of closure begins to settle in, another kind of pain may gently rise to the surface, not from what was done, but from how it was seen, or rather, how it was not seen. The moments where you were misunderstood, misread, judged in a way that did not reflect who you truly are. And for many, this leaves a deep mark, because there is something especially painful about being seen incorrectly. It creates a kind of inner tension, a feeling that your reality has been replaced by someone else's version of it, that your intentions were twisted, your character misrepresented, your truth overlooked. And even when you know what is real, the fact that someone else believes something different can feel unsettling, almost like a loss of control over your own identity. This is the trauma of being misjudged, not just the event itself, but the lasting impression it leaves. The sense that something about you has been defined inaccurately, and that definition may continue to exist in someone else's mind. And for a while the mind may try to correct it, to explain, to defend, to prove what is true. But as you have already begun to see, this effort can become another form of attachment, a quiet need to be seen correctly by everyone, to have your image aligned perfectly with your reality. And when that does not happen, it can create frustration, even resentment. The Stoics approached this with a different kind of clarity. They understood that you do not control how others perceive you. You do not control their thoughts, their interpretations, their conclusions. These are shaped by their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own limitations. And once something is formed in another person's mind, it may not change easily. This is not something you can govern, but what you can govern is how you see yourself. And this is where the healing begins. The pain of being misjudged comes from the gap between your truth and their perception. But when that gap becomes something you try to close constantly, it keeps you tied to their view. It keeps your attention focused outward, trying to adjust something that is not within your control. And in doing so, it takes you away from something more stable, your own clarity. The Stoics placed their focus here, on aligning with their own understanding of who they are, rather than chasing agreement from others. They knew that external opinions are not reliable measures of truth, that a person can be misunderstood without being wrong. This creates a different kind of foundation, one where your sense of self is not dependent on being seen perfectly. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this begins to feel more real. The memory of being misjudged may still be there, but it feels less urgent, less demanding. It no longer requires constant correction, because you are no longer measuring your worth through that lens. There is also something important about how the mind holds on to these moments. It replays them, trying to fix the misunderstanding, trying to find the perfect words that would have changed the outcome. But this replay keeps the experience active. It keeps the misjudgment alive. The Stoic practice is to recognize when this is happening and gently step back, to see that the need to correct the past is another form of resistance, another attempt to control something that has already settled in another person's mind. And once you see this, something begins to loosen. You realize that your truth does not need to be confirmed by everyone, that your character is not defined by a single perception. That being misunderstood does not diminish what is real. There is a quiet strength in allowing others to hold their own views without letting those views shape your identity. Not because their opinions do not matter at all, but because they are not the final authority on who you are. You are. This does not mean you become indifferent or detached from all feedback. It means you become discerning. You choose what to take in, what to reflect on, and what to let pass without holding on to it. And in that discernment, something changes. The emotional charge around being misjudged begins to fade. The need to defend yourself constantly softens. The mind becomes less occupied with correcting every misunderstanding, and the body begins to relax, because it no longer feels like it has to carry that tension. As the night deepens and the stillness settles in, this understanding becomes more grounded. The past remains, but it no longer holds the same power. The misjudgment becomes something that happened, not something that defines you. And in that shift, something important returns: peace. Not because everyone sees you clearly, but because you do. Not because every misunderstanding has been corrected, but because it no longer needs to be. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. And from that place, something steady begins to form. A sense that you can move through life without being shaped by every perception. A sense that your identity remains intact, even when others do not fully see it. A sense that your clarity is enough. And as that settles in, quietly, deeply, the weight begins to lift, leaving behind something lighter, something calmer, something that feels like freedom from the need to be perfectly understood. And as that need to be seen correctly begins to soften, something even deeper comes into view. Not just how others saw you, but how you began to see yourself because of what happened. Over time, certain experiences stop feeling like events and start feeling like identity. This is where the bond quietly forms. There is a subtle shift that happens when pain is repeated, remembered, and revisited long enough. The mind stops saying, "This happened to me," and begins to say, "This is who I am." Not always in clear words, but in quiet patterns, in the way you think, the way you react, the way you expect life to unfold. And slowly, the trauma becomes the lens through which everything is filtered. You begin to organize your thoughts around it, your decisions around it, your sense of self around it. Not because you chose to, but because the experience was strong enough, repeated enough, and left unresolved long enough to take root. This is how emotional trauma becomes identity. It shapes the narrative. It influences how you interpret new situations. It creates expectations that mirror the past. And before you realize it, you are no longer just remembering the experience. You are living from it. The Stoics saw something important here. They understood that while experiences shape you, they do not define you unless you allow them to become the center of your identity. They believed that your true self is not made of what has happened, but of your ability to think, to choose, to respond with awareness. And this distinction changes everything, because once trauma becomes identity, it becomes difficult to let go. Letting go begins to feel like losing a part of yourself. Even if that part is painful, it is familiar. It has been carried for so long that it feels like it belongs. But what belongs to you is not the pain itself. It is the awareness that holds it. This is where the Stoic shift begins. Not by rejecting the past, not by denying its impact, but by gently separating it from your sense of self. By seeing that the experience is something you carry, not something you are. This may feel subtle at first, but it creates space. When you begin to notice your thoughts, you start to see patterns, the way certain beliefs repeat, the way certain reactions arise automatically. And instead of identifying with them immediately, you begin to observe them. You see the pattern without becoming it. This is where the bond begins to loosen. Because identity is reinforced through repetition. Each time you think, "I am this way because of what happened," the connection strengthens. Each time you act from that belief without questioning it, the pattern deepens. But each time you notice it and step back, even slightly, you create distance. And in that distance, something new becomes possible. Choice. You are no longer locked into a fixed identity shaped by the past. You begin to see that there are other ways to respond, other ways to think, other ways to experience the present that are not dictated by what has already happened. This does not mean the past disappears. It means it no longer defines every part of you. There is also something important about how the mind seeks consistency. It tries to maintain a stable sense of self, even if that self is built around pain, because consistency feels safe, predictable, known. But growth requires movement. It requires allowing that sense of self to change. And this can feel unfamiliar because stepping away from an identity built on past hurt means stepping into something less defined, something not yet fully formed. And for a moment, this can feel uncertain. But within that uncertainty, there is freedom. The Stoics trusted this process. They did not cling to fixed identities. They focused on cultivating awareness, clarity, and character in the present moment. They understood that who you are is not something fixed in the past, but something that is shaped continuously by your choices now. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this understanding begins to settle more deeply. The old identity may still appear, but it feels less solid, less permanent, more like a pattern than a truth. And once you see it that way, you are no longer bound by it. You can acknowledge the past without organizing your entire self around it. You can carry the experience without letting it define your direction. You can remember without becoming. This is where something important begins to emerge. A sense of self that is not tied to pain, not built on what happened, but grounded in awareness, in presence, in the ability to choose how you move forward. And as this new sense of self begins to form, even gently, something shifts. The past loses its role as the center. It becomes part of the story, not the whole story. And in that shift, the bond begins to break, not through force, not through rejection, but through quiet understanding. You are not what happened. You are the one who lived through it. And that difference creates space, space to grow, space to change, space to become something beyond what the past tried to define. And in that space, something lighter begins to take shape, something that feels like freedom. And as that space begins to open, where you are no longer defined by what you felt, something even more important becomes possible. If you are not the pain, if you are not the past, if you are not the identity built around it, then what happens when a feeling rises now? Because it still will. Even with clarity, even with awareness, even with all the understanding you are beginning to carry, emotions will still come. Waves of sadness, moments of fear, flashes of anger, quiet heaviness. And when they arrive, there is a subtle fear that often follows. If I allow this, will it take over? This is where many people tighten again. They begin to resist, to suppress, to push the feeling away before it grows, because they believe that feeling deeply means losing control, that allowing emotion means becoming it. But this is not true, and this is where the Stoics offer something powerful. They did not teach the absence of emotion. They taught the presence of awareness within emotion, the ability to feel without collapsing into what is felt, to experience without losing the part of you that observes. This is the courage to feel without becoming the feeling. It begins with a simple but important shift. When a feeling arises, instead of saying this is me, you begin to notice this is something I am experiencing. That small difference creates distance, and in that distance, something stabilizes. You are no longer inside the emotion completely. You are aware of it. There is a quiet strength in this. Because emotions, when resisted, tend to grow stronger. When suppressed, they stay longer. But when they are allowed, without judgment, without immediate reaction, they begin to move, like a wave. They rise, they peak, they fall. But this movement can only happen when you do not interfere with it, when you do not try to hold it in place or push it away. This is where courage comes in. Not the loud kind, not the kind that forces action, but the quiet kind. The willingness to stay present with what you feel, even when it is uncomfortable, to allow the sensation without immediately trying to escape it. To trust that you can remain steady, even while the feeling moves through you. The The Stoics practice this by observing their internal state without reacting to it immediately. They would notice the emotion, name it, and then allow space before responding. This space is what prevents the feeling from turning into action, from turning into identity, from turning into something that takes over. Because most suffering does not come from the initial feeling. It comes from what follows, the story built around it, the reaction attached to it, the resistance against it. But when you remove these layers, what remains is just the feeling itself, and the feeling on its own is temporary. It does not last forever. It does not define you. It does not control you, unless you become it. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes quieter, this becomes easier to notice. A feeling arises, but it does not pull you in the same way. It is there, but it does not consume the entire space. You can still feel your breath. You can still sense your body. You can still observe what is happening. This is the difference. You are not lost inside the emotion. You are present with it. And this presence changes everything. There is also a kind of trust that begins to form, a trust that you do not need to avoid your feelings to stay safe, that you can experience them fully without losing yourself, that the mind does not have to shut down or react immediately to maintain control, because control is not about eliminating emotion, it is about not being ruled by it. There may still be moments when the feeling feels strong, when it pulls at your attention, when it asks to be followed. This is natural, but each time you notice it and remain present, you strengthen your ability to stay grounded. You begin to see that the feeling is not permanent, that it changes, that it passes, and with each passing wave, your confidence grows, not in avoiding emotion, but in being able to face it, to feel it, to allow it, without becoming it. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding settles more fully. The fear of emotion begins to fade. The need to control every internal shift begins to ease. The mind becomes less reactive, less urgent. And what remains is something steady, a quiet awareness that holds everything. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, all moving within it, but not defining it. And in that awareness, something becomes clear. You are not the feeling. You are the one who experiences it. And that difference gives you space. Space to breathe. Space to rest. Space to remain steady, even when emotions rise. And in that space, something powerful begins to grow. A calm that does not depend on the absence of feeling, but on the presence of awareness. A calm that stays, even as everything else moves. And from that calm, true rest begins. And as that calm awareness begins to steady the mind, another emotion often reveals itself in a different way. Not quiet, not subtle, but sharp, intense, immediate, anger. And while it may feel like the main force, there is often something deeper beneath it, something quieter that has been covered over for a long time. Because anger, in many cases, is not the beginning. It is the cover. There is a kind of energy in anger that feels powerful. It rises quickly. It creates movement. It gives a sense of control, even if only for a moment. And for the mind, this can feel safer than something softer, something more vulnerable. Pain, hurt, disappointment. These are quieter emotions. They do not defend. They do not push back. They do not create distance. They open something, and that openness can feel exposed, especially if it has been met with harm before. So the mind protects it by placing anger on top. Anger becomes a shield, a way to avoid feeling what sits underneath, because it is easier to feel strong than to feel hurt, easier to react than to sit with something that feels uncertain or vulnerable. This is why anger can appear so quickly, not because it is always the primary emotion, but because it is the most immediate layer. The Stoics understood this pattern well. They saw anger as a reaction that often comes from a deeper disturbance, a signal that something within has been affected, not just externally, but internally. And instead of feeding the anger, they looked beneath it. They asked, what is this protecting? What is it covering? What is actually being felt here? This is where the shift begins. Not by suppressing anger, not by judging it, but by observing it, allowing it to appear without immediately acting on it, creating a small space between the feeling and the reaction. In that space, something becomes visible, the hurt that was hidden, the disappointment that was not fully processed, the sense of being wronged, misunderstood, or dismissed. And when this deeper layer is seen, the intensity of the anger begins to change. Because anger, when it is not fed, does not stay the same. It softens, not all at once, but gradually. There is also something important about how the mind uses anger to maintain a sense of control. When something painful happens, especially something that feels unfair, the mind reacts strongly. It pushes back. It resists. It tries to restore balance by creating force. But this force does not always resolve the underlying feeling. It only covers it. The Stoics did not rely on this kind of force. They relied on clarity, on seeing the situation as it is, without adding unnecessary reaction. They understood that reacting from anger often leads to actions that do not align with your deeper values. And this creates more conflict, more tension, more regret. But when you pause, when you observe the anger instead of following it, you give yourself the chance to respond differently, to respond from understanding, not from impulse. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The anger may still rise, but it feels less overwhelming, less urgent, more like something that can be observed rather than something that must be acted on. And in that observation, something else becomes possible. You begin to feel what is underneath, not as something to avoid, but as something to understand. This is where real healing begins, because the deeper pain is what needs attention, not the surface reaction. When you allow yourself to feel that deeper layer without judgment, without resistance, it begins to move, it begins to release, and the need for anger as a shield begins to fade, not because you forced it away, but because it is no longer needed. There may still be moments when anger appears. This is natural. It is part of how the mind has learned to respond. But now there is awareness. You can see it. You can pause. You can choose not to be carried by it. And with that choice, something shifts. The pattern weakens. The reaction softens. The space between feeling and action grows. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding settles more fully. Anger is no longer something to fear or suppress. It becomes a signal, a doorway, a surface layer that points to something deeper. And when you learn to move through that doorway, instead of staying at the surface, you begin to uncover what truly needs to be seen. The pain beneath, the part that was hidden, the part that is ready to be released. And in that quiet release, something changes. The heat fades, the tension eases, the mind becomes calmer, and what remains is something more honest, more grounded, more aligned with who you are beneath the reaction. And from that place, something steady begins to return, a calm that is not forced, a clarity that is not reactive, a strength that does not need anger to protect it, just quiet awareness, holding everything, without being consumed by it. And as that deeper layer beneath anger begins to reveal itself, something even more tender comes into view. Not just the pain of what happened, but the quiet sense that something within you changed because of it, a version of yourself that existed before, a way of seeing the world that felt lighter, more open, more trusting. and now it feels different. There is a kind of grief that is rarely spoken about. It is not tied to losing a person or a place or something visible. It is the grief of losing a part of yourself, the version of you that did not yet know what you now know, the version that moved through life without certain fears, without certain doubts. This is the grief of lost innocence. It does not always announce itself clearly. It shows up quietly, in moments where you notice you are more guarded than before, in the way you hesitate where you once moved freely, in the subtle awareness that something inside you has changed. And for a long time, this grief may go unrecognized, because the mind is focused on the event itself, on what happened, on who was involved, on how it unfolded. But beneath all of that, there is another loss, the loss of a former self. The Stoics did not ignore this kind of change. They understood that life shapes you, that experiences leave marks, that certain things cannot be unseen once they are known. But they also did not treat this as something purely negative. They saw it as transformation, not the kind that erases what was lost, but the kind that allows something new to emerge. Still, before that emergence can be felt, there is a need to acknowledge what has changed, to allow yourself to recognize that something is different now, that the version of you before the wound existed in a certain way, and that way is no longer exactly the same. This is not failure, it is reality, and when it is not acknowledged, it lingers quietly, creating a sense of distance within yourself, a feeling that something is missing, even if you cannot fully name it. But when you allow yourself to feel it, something shifts. Not dramatically, but gently. You begin to see that it is natural to mourn what was lost, even if what was lost is not something you can return to. You allow the feeling to exist without trying to push it away, without telling yourself that you should be over it or that it should not matter. Because it does matter. It mattered enough to shape you. There is also something important about how the mind views innocence. It often sees it as something pure, something untouched, something that should not have been altered. And in that view, the change feels like damage. But the Stoics saw change differently. They understood that awareness grows through experience, that clarity often comes through difficulty, that depth is formed not in the absence of challenge, but in the way you move through it. This does not mean the loss is easy. It means it is not meaningless. The version of you that existed before may have been more open, more trusting, less aware of certain realities. And while that can feel like something valuable that was taken, there is also something that has been gained. Understanding, discernment, a deeper awareness of life as it is. And while this may not replace what was lost, it creates something else. Something that can still be whole. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this understanding begins to settle more deeply. The grief does not disappear, but it becomes softer, less sharp, less overwhelming. It becomes something you can hold without being pulled into it completely. You begin to see that you are not trying to return to who you were. You are learning to accept who you have become. And in that acceptance, something begins to ease. The tension between past and present softens. The need to go back fades. The focus shifts forward. There is also a quiet respect that begins to form for the version of you that existed before, for the openness, the innocence, the way you once moved through the world. You do not have to reject that version. You can honor it without trying to become it again, because it is part of your story, not something separate from it. And as you allow this, something important happens. The grief becomes integrated. Not something you carry as a loss, but something you recognize as part of your growth. A moment where life changed direction, where something ended and something else began. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this integration becomes more real. The sense of loss is still there, but it no longer feels like something that defines you. It becomes one part of a larger whole, and within that whole, you remain. Not the same as before, but not broken, just changed, just shaped, just carrying a deeper understanding of what it means to live. And in that understanding, something quiet begins to settle, a sense that even though something was lost, something within you continues, steady, aware, still capable of rest, still capable of peace. And as that quiet grief begins to settle into something softer, something more integrated, another pattern gently comes into awareness. Even when the pain is understood, even when the past has been seen clearly, the mind still returns, not always to feel, but to explain, to narrate, to go over the details again and again, as if each night is a courtroom where the past must be reviewed. And this can feel necessary, like if you do not think it through, you are ignoring it, like if you do not revisit it, something important will be lost. But over time, this constant narration becomes another way the mind stays tied to what has already happened. Not every scar needs to be reopened to be remembered. There is a quiet habit of turning pain into a story that must be told repeatedly. The mind walks through every detail, every angle, every possible explanation. It tries to organize the past into something complete, something that finally makes sense. But this effort does not always bring peace. Sometimes it keeps the wound active, because each time the story is told with the same intensity, the body responds as if it is happening again. The same emotions rise, the same tension appears, the same mental pathways are strengthened. And without realizing it, the act of trying to understand becomes a way of reliving. The Stoics recognize that there is a point where reflection becomes repetition, where thinking stops bringing clarity and starts reinforcing the same cycle, and they practiced stepping back from unnecessary mental narration, not to ignore the past, but to allow it to rest. There is a difference between understanding something and continuously explaining it to yourself. Understanding is quiet. It settles. It does not need constant repetition. But narration is active. It keeps the mind moving, analyzing, revisiting. And at night, when the body is meant to rest, this activity becomes more noticeable. The mind begins to fill the silence with stories. But silence does not need to be filled. This is where a gentle shift begins. Instead of following the story each time it appears, you begin to notice it. You see the starting point, the familiar opening, and instead of continuing it, you pause. You allow the thought to be there without building on it. This may feel unfamiliar at first because the mind is used to completing the story. But you begin to see that you do not need to finish every thought that begins. Not every memory needs to be explained. Not every feeling needs to be turned into a narrative. Sometimes the most healing thing is to let it pass without engaging. The Stoics practiced this kind of restraint, not as avoidance, but as discipline, the ability to recognize when a thought is no longer serving clarity, and gently return attention to the present moment, to the breath, to the body, to the quiet. This is not about suppressing the mind. It is about not feeding it unnecessarily. There is also something important about how the mind seeks completion. It wants every story to have a clear ending, a resolution, a final understanding. But not all experiences offer that. Some remain incomplete, not because you failed to understand them, but because they simply are. And learning to live with that without constant narration is a form of peace. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The urge to tell the story again begins to soften. The need to explain every detail fades. The thoughts still appear, but they do not carry the same pull. They pass more easily. And in that passing, something changes. The mind becomes quieter. The body relaxes more deeply. The night becomes a place of rest, not analysis. You begin to see that healing does not always come from thinking more. Sometimes it comes from thinking less, from allowing the mind to settle instead of constantly working. This is where true rest begins, not in solving everything, but in allowing what has already been understood to remain as it is, without needing to be revisited again and again. There will still be moments when the story tries to return. This is natural. It has been practiced many times. But now there is awareness. You can notice it. You can choose not to continue it. You can let it pass without turning it into a full experience. And with each time you do this, the pattern weakens. The mind learns that it does not need to stay active to be safe. That silence is not emptiness. That stillness is not neglect. It is rest. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding settles more fully. The space between thoughts grows. The need to narrate fades. The quiet becomes more comfortable. And in that quiet, something important happens. The scars remain, but they no longer need a story every night. They exist, without needing to be reopened. They are part of you, without needing to be explained. And you are free to rest without carrying them through every moment of silence. And in that freedom, the mind finally begins to settle. Gently, naturally, without needing to say another word. And as that quiet stillness begins to feel more natural, another layer gently comes forward. Even when the mind is calmer, even when the past has softened, there can still be a quiet tension underneath it all. A subtle question that lingers in the background. What if it happens again? This is one of the deepest fears the mind carries, not just the memory of pain, but the anticipation of its return. The idea that something similar could unfold again, that another moment could catch you unprepared, that the same hurt could find its way back into your life. And because of this, the mind becomes careful, not just cautious, but guarded. It begins to look ahead, scanning for signs, trying to predict, trying to prevent. It builds small walls, quiet defenses, subtle hesitations. And while these may feel protective, they can also create a constant sense of tension. Because when you are always preparing for pain, you are never fully at rest. The Stoics understood this fear, but they approached it from a different angle. They did not try to guarantee a painless world. They did not assume that harm could be completely avoided. Instead, they placed their trust somewhere else, within. They focused on building a strength that does not depend on circumstances being perfect, a steadiness that remains even when things do not go as planned. Because the truth is, life cannot be controlled in that way. Pain may return in different forms. Situations may change. People may act in ways you do not expect. But what can change is how you meet it. This is where Stoic discipline begins, not as strict control, but as quiet training, the practice of returning to yourself again and again, of strengthening your awareness, your responses, your ability to remain grounded even when things feel uncertain. Because the real safety is not in avoiding all pain. It is in knowing that you can face it without losing yourself. This is a different kind of trust. Not trust in the world being predictable, but trust in your ability to respond. When you begin to shift in this way, something changes in how fear is experienced. It no longer feels like something that must be eliminated. It becomes something that can be observed, understood, and gradually softened. You begin to see that the fear is not about what is happening now. It is about what might happen, and that distinction creates space. Because the present moment is not the same as the imagined future. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The tension of anticipation begins to loosen. The need to control every possibility fades. The mind becomes less focused on preventing pain and more focused on staying grounded. There is also something important about how the mind remembers past strength. Often it focuses on the pain itself, but overlooks the fact that you moved through it, that you adapted, that you endured. And this matters, because it shows that you are not as fragile as fear suggests. You have already faced difficulty. You have already responded to things you did not expect. And even if it was not perfect, even if it was not easy, you are still here. That is evidence, not of weakness, but of capacity. The Stoics returned to this idea often. They reminded themselves that whatever comes, they will meet it with the same awareness they are building now. Not perfectly, not without feeling, but with a steadiness that has been practiced. This is where courage begins to form. Not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to move forward despite it, to allow life to unfold without constantly bracing against it, to remain open enough to experience while grounded enough to respond. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding begins to settle more fully. The fear may still appear, but it feels less dominant, less controlling, more like a passing thought than a fixed state. You begin to feel that you do not need to predict everything to be safe. You do not need to avoid every risk to be steady. You do not need a painless world to feel at peace, because the strength you are building is not dependent on those things. It is internal. It is quiet. It is stable. And with each moment of awareness, it grows. The mind becomes less reactive. The body becomes more at ease. The future feels less threatening. And what remains is something steady, a sense that whatever comes, you will meet it. Not from fear, but from presence, from clarity, from a quiet trust in yourself that does not need everything to go perfectly. And in that trust, something shifts. The fear of being hurt again begins to lose its grip. Not because the world has changed, but because you have, and that makes all the difference. And as that quiet trust in yourself begins to take root, something almost unexpected starts to surface. The mind, which once kept looking ahead in fear, begins to turn gently towards something else. Not the future, but the past. Not to relive it, but to see it clearly, perhaps for the first time without distortion. And a simple, almost strange thought appears. What if the worst already happened, and you are still here? There is a kind of realization hidden inside this question. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, because for so long the mind has been preparing, bracing, anticipating what could go wrong, as if something devastating is always waiting just ahead. But when you pause and look back, something becomes clear. There were moments that felt unbearable, moments you thought you would not get through, moments that shook your sense of safety, your sense of identity, your sense of control. And yet, you moved through them, not perfectly, not without pain, but you did. This is where something begins to shift, because the mind often forgets what it has already endured. It remembers the pain, but not the strength that carried it. It focuses on what was lost, but not on what remained. And in doing so, it continues to operate as if you are still untested. But you are not. You have already faced difficulty. You have already experienced what you once feared. And the fact that you are here now is not something small. It is evidence. Evidence that you are capable of more than the mind gives you credit for. The Stoics returned to this idea often. They reflected on past challenges not to reopen wounds, but to recognize their own capacity, to remind themselves that they are not as fragile as fear suggests. that they have already lived through things they once believed would break them. And this recognition changes how the present feels. Because when the mind sees that survival is already part of your experience, the future begins to feel less threatening, not because nothing difficult will happen again, but because you are no longer entering it as someone untested. You are entering it with proof. There is also something important about how this realization settles into the body. When the mind stops seeing itself as vulnerable to every possible outcome, the tension begins to ease. The constant readiness, the subtle bracing, the quiet fear of what might come, it softens. Because something inside you knows you have been through something before, and you remained. This does not mean everything was resolved. It does not mean it was easy. But it means you were not destroyed by it, and that matters. There is a quiet strength in recognizing this, not as something you have to prove, but as something that is already true. A strength that does not need to be loud or visible, but exists in the simple fact that you are still here, still aware, still capable of moving forward. The Stoics did not see resilience as something that needed to be built from nothing. They saw it as something that reveals itself through experience, something that becomes visible when you look back and see that you have already endured. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this understanding begins to settle more deeply. The fear of the future loses some of its weight. The sense of vulnerability begins to shift. You begin to feel that you are not standing at the edge of something unknown. You are standing on ground that has already held you through difficulty. And this creates a different kind of confidence, not based on certainty, but based on experience. A quiet knowing that whatever comes, you will meet it in the same way you have met everything before. Step by step, moment by moment, with awareness, with presence. There may still be moments of doubt. This is natural. The mind does not change all at once. But each time you return to this recognition, each time you remember that you have already endured, something strengthens. The sense of self becomes more stable. The fear becomes less convincing. The future becomes less overwhelming. And what remains is something steady. A quiet realization that you are not defined by what could happen. You are shaped by what you have already moved through, and that shaping has given you something real, something grounded, something that cannot be taken away. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this realization becomes easier to rest in. You are not waiting to see if you will be strong enough. You already have been. You are not hoping to become capable. You already are. And in that quiet knowing, something shifts. The mind relaxes. The body eases. The future feels less heavy. And you begin to rest not as someone bracing for what might come, but as someone who has already proven, in ways that matter, that you can remain steady, present, still here. And that is its own kind of power. And as that quiet strength begins to settle into something real, something lived, another kind of weight gently rises into awareness, not from what was said, but from what was never said, the conversations that never happened, the words that stayed inside, the endings that never felt complete. There is a unique kind of tension in unfinished things, a feeling that something is still open, still unresolved, still waiting for a moment that never came. And because of this, the mind returns to it again and again, replaying what could have been said, imagining different endings, holding on to the hope that something might still close the gap. This is where the chain forms. Not from the past itself, but from the feeling that it is not finished. Unfinished conversations carry a quiet energy. They linger in the background, pulling attention back without warning. A sentence that never left your lips, a response you wish you had given, an apology you never received. And each time the mind returns, it tries to complete it. But the moment is gone, and yet the mind keeps trying. The Stoics understood that the past cannot be revised through repetition, that no amount of mental rehearsal changes what has already happened. But they also recognized that the feeling of incompleteness is real. It is something that must be seen, not ignored. Because what remains is not the conversation itself. It is the attachment to how it should have ended. There is a quiet belief that if the right words had been spoken, everything would feel different now. That if the apology had come, if the truth had been acknowledged, if the ending had been clear, then something inside you would finally settle. But as you have already begun to see, waiting for that moment keeps the mind tied to something that cannot return. And this is where the chain tightens, because the mind is holding on to a version of the past that no longer exists, trying to complete it in a way that reality does not allow. And each time it does this, it reinforces the sense that something is still missing. But what is missing is not the words, it is the acceptance. The Stoic approach gently shifts this focus. It does not deny that something felt incomplete. It does not dismiss the desire for closure, but it recognizes that completion does not always come from the outside. Sometimes it must be created within, not through imagination, but through clarity. You begin to see that the conversation ended as it did, not as it should have, not as you would have preferred, but as it did. And while that may not feel satisfying, it is real. And reality, when accepted, begins to settle. There is also something important about how the mind holds on to these moments as a way of maintaining connection. Even if the experience was painful, even if the person is no longer present, the unfinished conversation creates a link, a way of keeping the connection alive. But this connection is not always helpful, because it keeps the mind returning to the same place without resolution. The Stoics practiced releasing what was no longer within their control, not by forcing themselves to forget, but by recognizing when holding on was no longer serving them. They understood that some endings do not come with clear words, some simply end. And learning to allow that is part of peace. As the body continues to rest and the mind becomes calmer, this becomes easier to feel. The urge to replay the conversation begins to soften. The need to find the perfect words fades. The sense of incompleteness loosens. Because you begin to see that the ending, even if it felt unfinished, is already complete in reality. Nothing more is coming from that moment, and instead of resisting that, you allow it. There is a quiet strength in this acceptance, not because it feels perfect, but because it is real. You are no longer trying to change what cannot be changed. You are no longer holding the past open, waiting for something that is not arriving. You begin to close it gently, within yourself, not with the exact words you wished had been spoken, but with a simple understanding that what happened has already taken its place, that the silence, the absence, the lack of resolution is part of the ending, and it does not need to be rewritten. As the night deepens and the body softens further, this understanding begins to settle more fully. The chains of unfinished conversations begin to loosen. The mind becomes quieter, less pulled back into what could have been said. And in that quiet, something shifts. You are no longer waiting, no longer rehearsing, no longer holding on to a moment that cannot change. You are allowing it to be what it is, complete even if imperfect, closed even if it did not feel that way at the time. And in that quiet closure, something begins to release. The tension eases, the mind rests, the heart softens, and what remains is something lighter, a sense that you are no longer bound by words that were never spoken, no longer held by endings that never felt finished. Just present, just steady, just free to move forward without carrying that open space anymore. And now, as this long journey through the mind begins to settle, something quiet becomes clear. Nothing you felt was meaningless. Nothing you carried was wasted. Every memory, every reaction, every moment of confusion has been slowly reorganizing itself into clarity. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. You are no longer the same person who entered this night. The wounds are not your identity. The past is not your prison. The mind that once fought itself is now learning how to rest inside itself. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you can feel the difference. Less resistance, less noise, less weight. You did not erase yourself to heal. You returned to yourself. And that changes everything. If something in this meditation reached you, even quietly, leave a comment with the word, "I release." Not for anyone else, but as a signal to your own mind that something has shifted, that something is being let go. And if you want more of this, more clarity, more peace, more control over your inner world, subscribe to the channel and stay close to this kind of work. Because this is not the end of healing. It is the beginning of a different way of living. Now let the mind soften. Let the body sink, and let yourself rest, without carrying what you no longer need.